Chapter 1050. Princess Griffin and Amandina walked through the corridor one after the other. The soft light shone through the wide white arched window, leaving the window frame on the ground. Light and dust floated in the air. "Your Highness, the royal faction has been acting strangely recently," Amandina suddenly said softly. For a moment, she was under the bright light, the golden buttons on her suit sparkling under the sun, but she quickly stepped into the shadows, her eyes emitting a deep light in the darkness. Princess Griffin paused for a moment, then stepped forward again, her voice cold and calm. "They finally can't hold back anymore. How much time do we have left? Your Highness, the ministers are very dissatisfied with your excessive trust in the Lord. They are also quite dissatisfied with your sending Prince Heroes to cruise. The fact that the Lord is involved in the Empire's civil war has been a hot topic in the kingdom. Coupled with this incident, I'm afraid the ministers can't bear it anymore." Amandina hesitated for a moment. "In fact, there are already some bad rumors that have begun to spread outside." Princess Griffin stopped once more, and Amandina stopped as well. The two of them stood by a window, and the light fell on Griffin's upper body. Her silky silvery hair shimmered under the sunlight, and on the chest of her dress was an aquamarine gem, reflecting the disdain on her face. "Rumors? Are you saying that the bastards plotted to kill His Highness so that they can rightfully seize the throne?" After saying this sentence, Princess Griffin felt that she was a little too vulgar. Her face turned red, and her skin was almost transparent under the bright light. The blush extended down to the base of her neck. "How can I not know the dirty thoughts in those people's hearts?" Amandina looked at the princess in a daze, and could not help but praise the princess' beauty in her heart. "Your Highness, Amandina, the crux of the problem is the struggle for power," Princess Griffin replied softly, "so no matter where your lord is, and what he does, it will be the same. There will be no difference. Except for Lord Oberway, the royal faction is unreliable." Amandina was silent, knowing that the princess was right. "Then we should prepare in advance, Your Highness." Princess Griffin nodded and continued to walk forward. "Amandina, you should return to Valhalla." "But Your Highness, the Lord asked me to protect you." Princess Griffin turned to look at Amandina with a serious expression. She couldn't help but smile. "Amandina, who is stronger between the two of us?" Amandina was stunned. The two of them were passing between two arched windows. Their graceful figures were hidden in the shadows behind the strong light, and only the sound of their footsteps could be heard. Without waiting for Amandina to speak, Princess Griffin continued, "Amandina, Mr. Brando left you by my side because I do not trust anyone else, and I only trust you and Oberway. I plan to let Oberway go to Anthony and convince the Duke of Anthony, so I can only leave Valhalla to you. Besides, it is also your lord's property." Amandina's expression was dark and gloomy in the shadows. She also knew that Duke Anthony had just decided to pass the title of Duke to his eldest grandson, and now was the best opportunity. "However, Your Highness, it is too dangerous for you to stay alone in Ranner. Don't I have Miss Freya by my side? She will protect me well." "But Your Highness, you plan to let Freya go to Karsuk." Amandina was not tempted and replied with a frown, "Your Highness, don't think that I don't know about this." "Amandina, is this how you usually talk to Mr. Brando?" Princess Griffin smiled. "This is the first time I have seen such a serious aide like you, but I still have to thank you." Amandina blushed and said unhappily, "Your Highness, don't change the topic." The front became bright again. Princess Griffin stared at the golden leaves outside the white window. Every leaf was a sign of the coming season. "Don't worry, I'm safe here. The royal faction won't dare to do anything to me. But it's hard to say for you. Besides, I have to stay here. Erwin cannot fall into chaos. If I leave today, the kingdom will fall into chaos again tomorrow. Do you understand?" Amandina did not say anything. She looked at Princess Griffin's thin figure and sighed softly. "Your Highness, please ask for help from the Lord." Mr. Brando knows about our predicament. He will think of a way. I believe in him. Princess Griffin replied with a smile. Lady Mithril, thank you very much for your help. You are too kind. Lady Mithril removed her human disguise and revealed her original silver dragon form. She bent her neck slightly and looked at Brando with her mercury-like eyes. She gave a smile and replied, I did not keep an eye on the 3 traitorous dragons. This is the fault of us dragons, and we have caused a great loss to you humans. Fortunately, with your help, I was able to inform my clan immediately. She sighed softly. The way this dragon beauty sighed was extremely elegant, as if others would empathize with her and feel pity for her. It's a pity that the Dragon Queen has escaped. Even so, we will still stay in the mortal world for a while to search for her whereabouts. The mountain wind howled and seemed to become even wilder in this season. Near and far, the mountains were filled with an evergreen walkway. There was a hint of bleakness and coldness in the surroundings, as if indicating that summer was about to end. Autumn had already swept in with the cold wind from the direction of the wilderness of the 4 realms. In many places, the mountains and forests were dyed with a conspicuous red. The valley was still gloomy and gloomy. Corpses, broken armors, and flags were strewn all over the place, telling of the great battle that had taken place here. The corpse of a black dragon lay in the valley, and the fierce battle that had broken out in the vicinity had completely changed the direction of the nearby mountains. Not to mention the soldiers of Toquinin and Georgandy Ridge. Thousands of dragon corpses were piled up at the bottom of the valley, and as for the golden mane lion mane beast men, they were all dead. Except for a small number of Toquinin soldiers who had fled, almost all the forces of the Temple of the Earth had perished. The cavemen of Georgandy Ridge fled relatively quickly, but the high-ranking troops were also lost. The remaining troops were not a concern, and it was even suspected that they would not dare to return to the surface. All in all, this was a rare victory, and it was not an exaggeration to say that the 2 alien armies had completely disintegrated. Although Brando knew that there might still be troops of Georgandy Ridge and Toquinin in Anslova and Anzaruda, this battle was enough to scare them out of their wits. After this, it was hard to say if they would have the courage to go north. As for whether the White Lion Guard should go south, Brando did not think that he needed to help Leneret reclaim her territory. He looked silently in the direction of the valley. This battle was, in fact, a little beyond his expectations. He only wanted to give the allied forces of Georgandy Ridge and Toquinin a head-on blow, but he did not expect it to end up in a battle of annihilation. The wind whistled in the sky, and the branches of the dead trees on the top of the mountain were swayed. Brando had to hold on to his windbreaker. He looked up and saw a huge shadow descending from the sky. It was a few dragons of different colors. They spread their wings and circled above Brando's head, almost covering the sky. These dragons were the biggest contributors to the change of the war. Brando looked up. He and the dragons looked at each other silently. No one spoke first. There were a total of 7 dragons in the sky. Brando only recognized the red dragon in the middle. It had 2 heads, which was rare. It should be the legendary dragon, Blaze. This deformed dragon was one of the strongest dragons and one of the 3 longest living dragons. It was said that it was born in the era before the advent of chaos. At that time, it was still the era when the Myernas ruled the land. It had participated in the War of the Holy Saints and was one of the commanders at that time. They are thanking you, Mithril explained. You have done them a great favor. Brando retracted his gaze and looked at the Lady of the Silver Dragon curiously. You dragons and the Bugas hardly intervene in the affairs of the mortal world. Ordinary people often think that you are proud of the world, but now it seems that you do not want to do so. Just 3 traitorous dragons, do they have such a big impact on you? I can't answer that question, Mithril shook her head. But I can tell you that we do not intervene in the affairs of the mortal world because we are bound by a sacred oath. Brando was curious. What kind of oath could bind the dragons and the equally powerful Bugis? But if this oath was so terrifying, the Bugis and dragons did not seem to be completely uninvolved in the affairs of the mortal world. For example, this time, they showed great flexibility instead of rigidly adhering to the oath. Mithril seemed to have seen through his thoughts and said, "This time, the Bugis and us had no choice. Everything before our eyes is a continuation of the mistakes we made decades ago. Speaking of which, we all owe your grandfather a great debt of gratitude." The Lady of the Silver Dragon said, "This time, we helped you win this war. On one hand, it was to punish the 3 traitorous dragons, but on the other hand, it was also to return the favor to your grandfather. However, the mistakes made by the Dragon Queen and the others are actually related to what you saw on the final battlefield decades ago, right?" Brando suddenly asked. Mithril glanced at him. "I can't say for sure." Brando suddenly saw a silver dragon flying lower in the sky. The dragon looked somewhat similar to Mithril, but its body was more majestic. A few silver tentacles hung down from its long and narrow dragon head. "That's my sister," Mithril explained. "She's thanking you for saving me." Brando shook his head. "Actually, it's not really a rescue. At that time, Lady Mithril and I were just allies. After all, in front of the 3 dragons, I didn't have much power to protect myself. But no matter what," the Silver Dragon Lady smiled and said, "it's a fact that you've saved me. We dragons have always been grateful." For some reason, Brando suddenly thought of a small figure when he heard this. He felt nostalgic and could not help but ask, "Lady Mithril, do you know a golden dragon?" "Golden dragon?" Mithril was slightly startled. Golden dragons and silver dragons are both superior dragons. There are very few of them among the dragons. We should be familiar with each other. Her name is Alaz." "Oh, her." The Lady of the Silver Dragon had a strange expression. "She seems to have cheated during her coming-of-age ceremony and was locked up. That guy has already escaped." A voice in the sky said. The one who spoke was Mithril's sister. She nodded at Brando and said, "Lord Blazegold is furious because of this. Little one, if you see her, it's best if you stay away. She's a big problem now." When Brando heard this, he immediately broke out in cold sweat. He had a feeling that the little female dragon would come looking for him. Of course, it was not a problem if she came looking for him. The problem was that according to Mithril's sister, she was now a ticking time bomb. Who knew if the golden dragon would vent its anger on him because of this? He could only pray that the little witch would not find him. At least not until this series of problems was solved. Mithril seemed to have seen through his worries and reminded him, "Don't forget, the Elven Queen also owes you a favor. The wild elven royal family has an heirloom treasure called the Dragon Avoidance Orb. It is said that it can make you completely disappear from the dragon's perception range. This orb is one of the gifts of the Dragon King Bahamut. Its full name is Greenfield Trace, or Bahamut's Promise. It is one of the 2 sacred items of the Dragon King, along with the Crimson Blessing. This treasure is meaningless to the wild elves. They have a good relationship with the dragons and have no use for it. You saved her daughter, why don't you ask her to lend it to you?" Brando was slightly surprised and could not help but look in another direction. In that direction, the little elf and her draconic companion were following behind a tall elven beauty with dejected faces. Behind her was an entire squad of wild elven guards and dozens of howling archers. These were the guards of the wild elven royal court, and the other party was the current elven queen. She had arrived with the dragons, and her purpose was naturally to find the wild elven princess who had been missing for a long time. It seemed that when they were discovered by Eloranta, the great sage had already told the queen the whereabouts of the little elf. "Is it okay?" Brendel looked at the naughty elf who was crying and unwilling to be separated from Kiara. He was very curious when the 2 of them became so close, so he asked Mithril. The silver dragon lady nodded at him. She'll definitely agree. That thing doesn't mean much to the wild elves. She can see the relationship between you and the dragon clan. Even if it's only for that reason, she'll still lend it to you. Also, Mithril blinked at him, you saved my life and helped us so much. Don't forget to ask Lai Yen for a treasure. If I'm not wrong, if you don't ask, they won't give it to you. You know, we dragons have always been very stingy in this regard. Brando could not help but look up at the silver dragon lady with great curiosity, but Lady Mithril, you seem to be an exception. That's because I don't have to pay for it, the silver dragon lady replied very slyly, do you understand? It's now or never. A treasure of the dragons, Brando heard this and his heart skipped a beat. Chapter 1051. Thank you very much for saving my daughter, Mr. Brando. When he arrived in front of the Elven Queen of Eloranta, Brando's eyes lit up as he thought to himself, what a great beauty. The Elven Queen wore a silver laurel crown on her head. Her slightly curly blonde hair draped over her shoulders, and her light green eyes were as vast as the sea of stars, shining with the light of wisdom. A snow-white robe tightly wrapped around her slender body, and the opening in front of her chest would dazzle mortals. It seemed a little too revealing, but it made her look outstanding. A silver belt closed the deep opening, and when one looked up, one could almost see the flat upper half of her lower abdomen and faintly discernible cleavage. In his previous life, Brando had long heard of the Elven Queen's beauty, but he had never had the chance to see her. 10 years later, she went into seclusion, and after that, Princess White took over the fate of the wild elves from her hands, and the wisest princess in history was born. He couldn't help but look at the little elf with tears and snot running down her face, but at least until now, she was just a naughty child no matter how he looked at her. The Elven Queen gracefully bowed slightly, thanking Brando. Her appearance was somewhat similar to the little elf, but she looked much more mature, showing a classic beauty. Brando was a little surprised that the Elven Queen knew his name, but he thought that it must have been the dragons who told her. Your Majesty, he was about to speak. The Elven Queen smiled and interrupted him, the great sage has mentioned your name to me. Obviously, there was only one great sage, and that was Eloranta. The great sage actually knows my name. Brando didn't expect that he would be able to attract the attention of the world's top figure, and couldn't help but feel a little proud. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for being in history and changing history. He recalled the night when he had just crossed over to Bucci, facing the invasion of the Roman Black Rose. At that time, he was so insignificant that he couldn't even be considered a chess piece on the battlefield. But who would have thought that in the most inconspicuous corner of the world, an unknown young man would change everything? The Elven Queen saw the look on Brando's face and understood his thoughts. She couldn't help but smile, but she was gentle and didn't directly expose this beautiful misunderstanding. She only replied tactfully, I knew you when you were very young. Brando's face suddenly turned from red to white, then from white to black. He coughed, felt his cheeks burning, and said with an unnatural expression, Your Majesty knows my grandfather. The Elven Queen gently shook her head, Your grandfather is a hero, but I don't know him. Then you are. Mr. Brando, there must be something important for you to come looking for me, right? Brando looked at the Elven Queen suspiciously, not understanding why she wanted to change the topic, but this was indeed the question he was most concerned about. He nodded honestly and said, It's not an important matter, but I heard that Your Majesty has a dragon avoidance orb. Recently you won the Wizard of Oz? Yes. There are some problems. The Elven Queen replied with a smile. Brando's heart thumped. Although he had expected that it wouldn't be that easy to lend the dragon avoidance orb, he didn't expect the Elven Queen to reject him so directly. But after thinking about it, it was understandable. After all, this treasure had been passed down in Eloranta for thousands of years. As an heirloom of the royal family, how could it be lent just like that? But the Elven Queen's next explanation immediately made Brando understand the problem of his request. Mr. Brando, don't you know that the dragon avoidance orb needs to be confirmed before it can be used? So if we give it to you, I'm afraid we won't be able to take back this treasure. Hearing this explanation, Brando's heart sank. He finally understood what the other party was talking about. The Wizard of Oz was a sacred item that needed to be recognized before it could be used. If the wild elves gave this treasure to him, it wouldn't be a loan, but a gift. At least before he died of old age or died an unnatural death, the wild elves wouldn't be able to take back this treasure. And the lifespan of a human with a certain level of strength was generally around 150 to 200 years. For someone like him who had activated his elemental activation, it wouldn't be strange for him to live for 4 or 5 centuries. At that time, it would be hard to say if he could still avoid the dragon avoidance orb. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, I was rude. After understanding that his request was too outrageous, Brando didn't insist. He just replied with some pity. At the same time, he was already thinking about how to guard against the ticking time bomb that could appear at any time. However, it was at this time that the Elven Queen smiled and shook her head at him. Mr. Brando, I didn't say that I wouldn't give this treasure to you. Brando was stunned for a moment and looked up at the other party in surprise. The Elven Queen smiled and said, You saved my daughter's life and our race is indebted to you. And although the dragon avoidance orb is indeed a priceless treasure, it actually doesn't have much value to our race. The reason why we have kept it in Eloranta is because of the dragons. The dragons don't want it to fall into the hands of those who have bad intentions. But Mr. Brando is also a benefactor of the dragons. I don't think they will make things difficult for you. As long as Mr. Brando can get the consent of the dragons, this orb is for you to use. It turned out that the root of the problem was still the giant dragons. Come to think of it, the use of this orb was too much against the dragon race. If someone who was plotting against the dragon race got their hands on it, these giant dragons would inevitably have to live in a state of constant vigilance. This was undoubtedly unacceptable for such a proud species. Brando thought this through and quickly bowed to the Elven Queen to express his gratitude. In any case, the other party could have used this excuse to brush him off, but she wholeheartedly pointed out the right path for him. He couldn't help but be touched by her sincerity. But just as he was about to go and bargain with the big lizards who were famous for being stingy, the Elven Queen stopped him again. Mr. Brando, please wait. Brando turned his head with some doubts and asked, Your Majesty, is there anything else? Mr. Brando, the value of this orb is too low for you. If we only give it to you, outsiders will say that the wild elves of Eloranta are ungrateful. So whether the dragons finally agree to let you take the dragon avoidance orb or not, we still intend to give you another gift. This. Even with the mentality of a player who pursued maximum benefits, Brando couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. Your Majesty, this treasure is already very significant to me. He didn't lie about this. It was indeed very significant. If he didn't have this treasure, he might have died without a corpse because of his relationship with the little female dragon. So in a sense, the Elven Queen agreeing to give him the dragon avoidance orb was equivalent to saving his life. The Elven Queen smiled and interrupted him, Don't be in a hurry to refuse. This gift is not unrelated to Mr. Brando. It was left in Eloranta by someone related to you. That person wanted to return a favor to us. Today, we're returning it to you. It's just right to return it to its rightful owner. Brando was slightly startled. He thought that the only person who had something to do with him and was so resourceful was probably his grandfather. But considering that the other party didn't know his grandfather, he couldn't help but be curious about the identity of the person mentioned by the Elven Queen. Wait, he asked, Your Majesty, is the person you're talking about related to my grandfather? The Elven Queen nodded without hesitation. Then what is his identity? Is he my grandfather's subordinate? To this question, the Elven Queen only smiled and said, "I'm not too sure about this, but that thing has been left in Eloranta for many years. It has helped us a lot. I think you must have a use for it." As she said this, the Elven Queen's gaze extended behind Brando. Brando was too embarrassed to look back, but he could guess that it was probably the place where Princess Magadol, Eugenie and the rest were. He was a little confused about the meaning behind the Elven Queen's glance, but he didn't directly ask, "What is that, Your Majesty?" "The Fountain of Singing." "Have you heard of it, Mr. Brando?" "The Fountain of Singing." Brando couldn't help but gasp when he heard the name. How could he not have heard of the name of this thing? In fact, this thing had an even more famous name in Wonde, and that was the Fountain of Youth. It was said that those who drank its water would be able to retain their youth forever and live forever. Of course, this was an exaggeration. There was no such thing as eternity in this world. Even the undead of Madara would eventually walk towards destruction. But those who drank from the Fountain of Youth would be able to retain their youth forever without a doubt. Anyone who drank the water of the Fountain of Youth would have their appearance fixed at the moment they drank the water. If it was a child, their appearance would be fixed at the age of 15 or 16. Because of this effect, the water of the Fountain of Youth in Wonde was a rare treasure that everyone, especially the noble ladies, would go crazy for. In addition to this effect, the Fountain of Youth could also heal pain. Its effect might not be better than that of high-grade holy water, but it could restore limbs and injuries. Just from this point alone, people would be willing to pay any price to get it. But because the Fountain of Youth only appeared in the Black Forest, and its capacity was often extremely limited, most of the Fountain of Youth would only be able to fill a few cups of water before drying up and disappearing. Therefore, the water of the Fountain of Youth was extremely rare on the continent, only appearing twice in the year of the gathering stars and the year of the waning moon. Now, the Elven Queen was telling him that there was a Fountain of Youth in Eloranta that had been used for nearly half a century and still hadn't dried up. What kind of concept was this? What shocked him even more was that this thing was given to the Wild Elves by someone who was related to him. How big of a deal was this? No wonder the Wild Elves didn't hesitate to give him the Dragon Avoidance Orb. After receiving such a great favor, the Dragon Avoidance Orb was really nothing compared to it. As soon as Brando heard the words Fountain of Singing, he was immediately tempted. He couldn't help but be tempted. Not to mention that he had already promised to use the Fountain of Youth to restore Dilfari to her original state to make up for her sacrifice in the Battle of Ampere Seal, and this thing might also be useful for the deer banshee's crystallization disease. But these were not the key. The key was that most of the Fountain of Youth was associated with another thing. That was the singing silver. And only half of the Fountain of Youth with the singing silver was qualified to be called the Fountain of Singing. This thing was much rarer than the Fountain of Youth. Even in the depths of the Black Forest, legends about it only existed in legends. And to Brando, the singing silver was associated with another thing. This was a secret that only a few people in Valhalla knew. Once he had an endless supply of the singing silver, Babu and his divine craftsmen could continuously repair the Valkyrie's armor. Valhalla would also have a true Tier 8 army, Brunhilde and her Valkyrie servants. Although reviving the Valkyrie's Valkyrie required the gold of the river, cutting off future fangs and windrider foals, the gold of the river was far less precious than the singing silver. Not to mention other things, the dragons would definitely have it. As for cutting off future fangs, Brando had already planned to ask the Kohua sisters for some of their fangs that had been broken in the past. It shouldn't be a problem. In this way, other than the windrider foals, the other problems would be easily solved. As for the Valkyrie's mounts, Brando could also buy them from the Wind Elves. Although the price was a little ridiculous, just a windrider foal could be exchanged for a Tier 8 creature with outstanding combat strength. This was a good deal, and Brando had to do it no matter what. He couldn't help but be immersed in his beautiful fantasy. The Elven Queen seemed to have seen through his thoughts and had to remind him tactfully, "Mr. Brando, before returning the item to its rightful owner, I have to remind you about the problem with the Fountain of Singing. Your Majesty, what do you mean? Brando recovered from his fantasy and asked after a slight pause. He had never heard of any side effects of the Fountain of Youth. Because of this, people thought that it was a gift from Martha. The Fountain of Singing was actually discovered in the Argean region. It is a rare living spring, so it can produce spring water continuously. But because of some previous problems, the spring water has been contaminated, so there may be some side effects. The Elven Queen explained, it is said that the Dragon clan had used a special method to extract the power of the spring water. As a result, it was contaminated by dark magic. Although its spring water still has the effect of the spring of youth, the body of the person who drank it might have some changes. Forgive me, but I don't quite understand. In short, people who drink it will immediately stop aging and maintain a certain stage. At the same time, they will lose all power, including natural and supernatural powers, and... Brando frowned. The side effects of this thing were a little too shocking. If the Elven Queen didn't lie to him, then people who drank it would become a useless person, at least according to the standards of this world. And they will lose the ability to reproduce. Chapter 1052. Although Brando did not understand why the Elven Queen wanted to emphasize this, it was indeed a problem. In Wonde, for the children of the nobles, losing the ability to reproduce was a serious matter. This was because while they enjoyed the power of the family, they were also responsible for the prosperity of the family. For unmarried noblewomen, infertility was even more serious, because it would make them lose the ability to marry into a political alliance. Although for Brando, who had half the soul of a modern person, perhaps losing the ability to make political marriages was not necessarily a bad thing, he had to admit that in Wonde's aristocratic system, this was almost the greatest value of a woman's existence. Many noblewomen valued it very much. It was actually related to their future status. He did not know what Dilfari was thinking about this, but he had a vague feeling that as the future successor of the Yenbao family, Dilfari might not accept the first condition. She had paid such a high price to learn demonic magic in order to revive the Yenbao family. How could she be willing to become a useless person? However, there was no need to reject this gift. At the very least, even if others couldn't use the spring water, it wouldn't be a problem for Aina. Aina was a card creature. Her power wasn't built on her own, but was given by the laws. Therefore, it was very likely that she could use the spring water. The contaminated spring water was not harmful to her, and for a card creature, it did not matter whether she could reproduce or not. Moreover, he had confirmed with the Elven Queen that there was no problem with the mineral in the spring water. For the sake of the singing silver, he had to accept this gift. He had a feeling that the Elven Queen's last reminder was not without reason, but he could not think of a reason for it. When he asked again, the Elven Queen said that it was just a reminder. In the end, he could only think that he was too paranoid after going through several battles. The Elven Queen quickly transferred the Spring of Youth. Although the Wild Elves' spatial magic was not as profound as the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and they did not have a legendary teleportation spell like the Door of Flame, it was not a problem for them to transfer small objects through a short teleportation. Springs of Youth varied in size. It was said that the large ones could cover an area of several hundred meters. However, the Spring of Youth of the Wild Elves was very slim. It was only a few meters long and wide, and it was no taller than a person and a half. It wasn't difficult to move it over with spatial magic. When the Spring of Youth fell to the ground, Brando immediately discovered that it was indeed very different from ordinary Springs of Youth. The spring water of the Spring of Youth was clear and transparent, without any impurities. Even in a dark environment, the surface of the water sparkled with a silvery light, looking incomparably pure and holy. But this city of youth. The spring water had a strange dark red color, and there was a layer of faint red mist on top of the spring water. There was also a faint trace of a strong exotic fragrance, which smelled like the fragrance of laurel. Can this thing be drunk? Brando could not help but be very suspicious. No matter how he looked at it, this spring water looked like something that the demons had done. God knew what would happen if he drank it. However, the Elven Queen told him that other than the flaws she mentioned before, this spring water was no different from the real spring of youth. It would not cause people to fall into depravity or make them go crazy, although it did look very strange. As for the evil aura of the spring water, it was because of the dragons. They had once used this spring of youth to purify the power of the demons. However, the evil aura in the spring water had already been completely evaporated during the purification. The reason why the spring water had such side effects had nothing to do with the demons. It was because the sacred spring water had been damaged during the ritual. It was just as serious damage. The wild elves had been neutral most of the time in Wonde, and this generation's queen and the future Princess White had a very good reputation in history. Brando believed that the Elven Queen had no reason to lie to him. He also saw a faint silver light in the depths of the spring water, and understood that it was the ore of the singing silver. This miraculous metal didn't only exist in the singing spring. In fact, it was an associated mineral with the dragon blood gem, which was rich in magic. However, the dragon blood gem was even rarer than the singing silver. Therefore, there was no way to obtain the singing silver. The singing silver was extracted from the ore. After it was refined, the whole body was silver white, but it had a natural magic texture. As long as it was placed in water, it would naturally produce beautiful music. That was how the singing silver got its name. However, Brando felt a little strange. It seemed that the elves had not touched the ore in the spring water in the past few decades. Could it be that they left the spring water in Eloranta just to wait for the day when they could return it to its rightful owner? He asked the Elven Queen this question, but the latter just smiled and did not answer. She told him that the spring water had more commemorative value than practical value in Eloranta. As for why, he would naturally understand one day. Brando felt that this answer was better than not telling him anything, so as not to arouse his curiosity and make him fall from the sky, making him extremely uncomfortable. He faintly felt that the Elven Queen might not be as kind as she appeared on the surface. She exuded a kind of black-bellied aura from head to toe. The dragon avoidance orb had always been with the Elven Queen. It looked like a transparent crystal ball, but the edges were plated with a strange green light. When Brando took it from Her Majesty the Queen, it was cold to the touch. Only then did he realize that this thing was actually made of liquid. When it was held in the hand, the surface tension was enough to keep it in the form of a water ball, but with a little force, the liquid would spread and wander around the user's body. The Elven Queen told him that this was the correct way to use this treasure: let it spread into a thin layer of film, and hide the person who wanted to hide inside it, so that it could block all detection methods of the dragons. Soon, Brando recognized the orb as its owner under the latter's guidance, and then experimented with it several times. He found that the spread of the liquid could completely envelop a person and breathe without hindrance. It was just a little uncomfortable the first time, but he would soon get used to it. It was just that Brando always felt that it was his first time using it. The Elven Queen deliberately did not remind him, and as a result, he almost made a fool of himself in front of everyone and choked on several mouthfuls of water. But when he looked at the other party, the latter just gave him a kind smile. Now, Brando vaguely understood where the Elven Queen's bare aura came from. It turned out that it was a family inheritance. After thanking the elves, the negotiations with the dragons went much smoother than expected. However, the scene of a few dragons in a circle pushing the responsibility to each other made everyone's jaws drop. It was as if from then on, these elegant, powerful, and mysterious creatures were no longer as noble as before. Most people's impression of them suddenly collapsed and turned into fragments on the ground. Brando, on the other hand, was already familiar with the temperament of these flying lizards. In the end, it took half a day for the dragons to finally decide who would pay the reward for Brando's bravery. Their consensus was that whoever benefited from it would pay the bill. In the end, the dragons would pay half of the reward, and the silver dragon Lady Mithril, who was indebted to Brando, would have to pay the other half. Mithril did not expect that she would shoot herself in the foot. Her face was gloomy for the whole afternoon. Fortunately, she did not make things difficult for Brando. She only cursed a few times in her heart. Those damn old bastards. Her elder sister was obviously not excluded from this list. Brendel had a good impression of the silver dragon lady and suggested to her in private if she wanted to give her half of the loot, but Mithril shook her head generously. "I won't cheat you of your money, little one. You're my savior, and I, Mithril, am willing to pay you back. I'm not that poor." Then she added, "Don't worry, my sister and I will each take half of the reward." Brando always felt that he had caused the dragon sisters to turn against each other. He could not help but feel very guilty. As for the part of the dragon clan, the remaining dragons argued again. Finally, before nightfall, the oldest two-headed dragon, Inferno, came to a conclusion. They would pay first, and then continue to argue when they returned. In short, he could not lose face in front of his human friends. Brando was helpless against these stingy fellows. In the end, it was unlikely that he would be able to obtain the so-called secret treasure of the dragon clan. He took the opportunity to make a request, hoping to get a portion of the gold in the river from the dragon clan. It would be best if they could give him a batch of imperial windfalls. Hearing this request, the dragons were relieved. They were obviously relieved. The gold in the river, also known as the witch's gold, had an extraordinary origin, but it was not rare. At least, it was much cheaper than the rare treasures they had collected. Inferno had an expression of, "You're not bad, kid. You can still see the big picture." After praising Brando, she agreed to his request and promised to give him 500 pounds of gold in the river. As for the imperial windfalls, the dragon frankly told him that they did not have any. Because the dragons could fly by themselves and did not need mounts, they naturally would not raise these things. However, he was given an additional reward of hundreds of thousands of gold coins, so he did not suffer a loss. Brendel did not care about the hundreds of thousands of gold coins at all, because he had been stunned by the unexpected surprise for a long time. He did not even dream that the dragons would give him 500 pounds of river gold with a casual swipe of their hands. Brendel could not help but feel a wave of extravagance wash over him. A sense of inferiority arose in his heart. One had to know that his original expectation was only a mere 50 pounds. He was glad that he did not take the initiative to ask. At the same time, he thought to himself, "Martha above, how rich are these damn lizards?" If he did not know how terrible the golden folk were, he would have almost gone out to rob the dragons. Late at night, the dragons finally flapped their wings and left towards the north. The elven queen also took away the crying little elf. Before the elves left, Kiara comforted the elf that she would definitely go and see her. However, Brando suspected that this was purely a lie. When she returned to Erewhon, how would she have a chance to leave Cypher? After consulting with Dilfari, the latter did not hesitate to reject the wild elf's spring of youth. "My lord, thank you for your kindness, but as the heir of Yenbao, I cannot become a useless person. Moreover, as the daughter of a noble family, if I can't have children, it will damage the family's reputation." After hearing the side effects of the spring water, Dilfari calmed down. Since the battle in Ampere Seal, she had overdrawn her life force, and her health had been deteriorating. These days, she had been plagued with illness and could hardly leave the bed. Even when she was on a diplomatic mission to cruise, she spent most of her time in the carriage. Even Edney, the most delicate of the ambassadors, behaved much better than she did. However, if she was asked to give up all her previous efforts and be a weak and powerless noble lady, she would never accept it. The heir of Yenbao could be a dead person, but she could not be a useless person. That would bring shame to the family. Brando understood that she valued the glory of Yenbao more than anything else. He sighed in his heart and did not try to persuade her again. You don't have to worry. One day, I will help you find the real spring of youth, Miss Dilfary. Dilfary was slightly startled. She looked up at Brando, but did not refuse. Instead, she bowed slightly to him. Thank you, my lord. After Brando sent Dilfary away, he found that the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Empire had come to his door. Delphian was supported by the Silver Dragon Lady, Mithril. The latter had just quarreled with her sister, so she decided not to go back for the time being. She sat calmly in the wheelchair and said to him quietly, My lord, I don't mind. Brando was slightly startled. He could not help but look at the daughter of the Prime Minister in the wheelchair. Delphian was wearing a purple evening dress. The black stockings under the dress outlined her perfectly proportioned slender legs, but it could not hide the ugly scars on her snow-white skin. Her graceful figure and ample bosom were proof of the charm this young girl once possessed. Although Delphian used her long hair to cover half of her face, it was still impossible to see the horror under her long neck. Almost only a small part of her face still retained its original human appearance. The terrible disaster had almost taken away all her pride in the past. She could barely stand up from her wheelchair. When she stood up from the chair, her legs were faintly showing signs of atrophy. Her left hand could not move at all, and her right hand could only do limited movement. Her neck could only turn at half an angle. At this moment, she was basically equivalent to a useless person. Although there were many conflicts in the past, Brando could not help but feel his heart palpitate when he looked at her at this moment. However, he did not see any despair on her face. In her deep purple eyes, there was only calmness. Delphian quietly pursed her lips, waiting for his reply. Brando hesitated. Of course, he knew what the daughter of the Prime Minister was talking about. Miss Delphian, I will not give you the spring water. Why? You should understand. Delphian shook her head, My lord, it doesn't matter to me whether I have strength or not. I seek another kind of strength, wisdom and power. It does not necessarily require strength. On the other hand, after Elman's death, what does it mean to me whether I can have children? Brando could not help but frown at the mention of Elman. This was the root of everything. At that time, the daughter of the Prime Minister was hysterical like a madwoman. There was no doubt that love itself was not wrong. He hesitated for a moment before replying, Miss Delphian, about Elman's death. I know. Delphian coldly interrupted Brando, My lord, I said before that I will not pursue this matter. Brando looked at her and frowned. It was difficult for him to see through this woman's thoughts. To be honest, he was still not completely at ease with her. After all, this daughter of the Prime Minister had changed her attitude too much. He really could not guess what she wanted to do. If she really let go of all her hatred, then she could have quietly left. There was no need for her to help her former enemy. As for the reason she said that she wanted to borrow his hand to save her family, it was a little too stiff. If he had not seen the wisdom of this daughter of the Prime Minister, perhaps he would have some doubts. But with the abilities she had shown, it did not seem like she needed to rely on him. At least from an emotional point of view, he felt that he was not the best choice for her. Although Brando was not very sensitive to people's hearts, he was not stupid either. But what puzzled him the most was that at least until now, she had been helping him wholeheartedly. She had not done anything in secret. Thinking of this, he could not help but reply, Miss Delphian, although I do not quite understand what you are thinking in your heart, I do not understand what your intentions are. Perhaps we are not on the same path. But as long as you are willing to trust me, I have promised to find the real fountain of youth for Dilfary. I will definitely restore you to your original state. Consider it as compensation. Delphian's eyes flashed with a deep light. You do not owe me anything, my lord. If anything, it is I who owes everyone. I have caused a lot of trouble for you. She replied very calmly, I also want to believe that my lord will keep his promise. To be honest, you are the most special noble I have ever met. Yes, my lord. Miss Delphian. My lord, thank you for your kindness, but I have made up my mind. Brando looked at her and finally nodded silently. After getting Brendel's approval, Delphine let out a sigh of relief, and a smile of unknown meaning appeared on her face. The evening wind gently lifted her hair, and for a moment, it made her ferocious face not so ugly. The Prime Minister's daughter quietly looked at the sky from her wheelchair. After a while, she opened her mouth and said, My lord, this battle has come to an end. Basically, the expected goal has been achieved. After Miss Medici cleans up the remaining undead in the Wallach Pass, the Queen's plan in the East Metz can be said to be a complete failure. Brando nodded. The whole plan was not entirely his own. He was just the beginning. The rest of the plan was basically the work of the girl in front of him. Together with Medici and Senior's modifications and improvements, it finally led to today's great victory. Delphine's sudden mention of this matter was obviously not without reason. He waited for her to continue. And after the defeat of the White Legion, Jorgendy Ridge, and Toquinen, it will be difficult for the Silver Queen to end the battle in Metz quickly. Delphine paused for a moment. I think, in this case, she may directly attack you. Attack me? Yes, in my opinion, compared to the eldest prince, you may be a bigger threat in the eyes of the Silver Queen. The war between the eldest prince and Her Majesty is just a civil war among the Cruz people. But between you and her, it involves the core issue of who is the successor of the Dark Dragon. You, who have also inherited the power of the Dark Dragon, and with the support of the witches, you may have the ability to challenge her current power. But this is not what I want. I understand, Delphine replied, My lord, the others around you also understand, but Her Majesty does not. Or rather, she understands, but this is not important to her. Not to mention, my lord is the descendant of the sacred swordsman Darius. As one of the few people who witnessed the truth behind the Dark Curtain, your birth and background are not inferior to Her Majesty's. If my lord calls for help, there may not be fewer people than Her Majesty's. Brando felt that he did not have the ability to do so. At the very least, Jorgendy Ridge and the Lion folk would not listen to him. Not to mention, he had not even sorted out the forces in Erewhon. But he continued to listen to Delphine's analysis and asked, So, Miss Delphine, what do you think the Silver Queen will do next? Don't forget, it's not like she hasn't attacked us before. He was referring to the previous confrontation between the witches, which was almost a face-to-face battle, but the witches still failed. Yes, but if I were Her Majesty, I would change the method this time. Before this, no matter whether it was the assassination or the mobilization of the army, they all failed. This time, my lord, I have no choice but to let you fight on her home ground. But do you think I'm that stupid? Chapter 1053. As it turned out, it would. The smell of autumn was getting stronger by the day, and the heavy fruits on the branches hinted at the arrival of the harvest festival. After entering the month of Ariel, the crops in Metz began to reach their bumper harvest season. The military nobles continued to station their troops on the Western Front while they began to arrange for the farmers in their territories to carry out the autumn harvest. At this point, the Silver Queen's plan to attack Metz before the autumn harvest was completely ruined, regardless of whether it was the Eastern or Western Front. But it was not all for naught. After the great solar eclipse on Holy Day, the unnatural glaciers and snow from the Golden Needle Forest to the Silver Cove in East Metz gradually began to melt. The war on that day caused a devastating blow to the agriculture in this area. Both Fathomport and Ovchin encountered a food crisis, and the nobles had to urgently order food from Ludwig and Mihotefen to provide relief. The multiple solar eclipses over the past few days inevitably caused panic in this area. The astrologers told the people that this was caused by the chaos caused by the magic tide that only happened once in 1,000 years. Under such a background, the doomsday rumor spread like wildfire, and the forces lurking in the shadows took the opportunity to flourish. Because of this, the eldest prince had to impose martial law in Fathomport and Novchin. This move actually slowed down the progress of their counterattack on the eastern front. But it was worth mentioning that after Medisha and Maynard recovered the passage to the Golden Needle Forest in the Latch of Wa, the military nobles stationed in the north took the opportunity to advance east and recover the Flowerleaf territory, eliminating the remnants of the White Legion that gathered there. Duke Vina obeyed Brando's orders and stationed a large number of troops at the Orang Pass. On the other hand, she ordered people to rescue the second daughter of the Archduke of Flowerleaf, Faina's sister, Ilya, who was under house arrest in Varasa Castle, and escorted her to Fathomport to meet her sister. There was also an episode that happened in between. After seeing her sister who had been imprisoned for many days, Faina lost control of her emotions. She hugged her sister and burst into tears. In fact, ever since Mihodafen had been locked up in the prison van, her mind had been constantly tense. Even after being rescued by the others, she was still worried about the safety of her father and sister. It was only when the situation in East Metz had reversed, when Medisha and Maynard had taken over the Latch of Tile and the passage to the Golden Needle Forest, and when Duchess Wayna had taken over the Flowerleaf territory, that the heavy burden in her heart had finally been lifted. However, the moment he saw his younger sister, the negative emotions that had accumulated over the past few days inevitably erupted. The Crown Prince's counterattack was slow, but in the second half of the month of harvest, the sporadic battles in the eastern Metz and Mihodafen had come to an end. Following Brando to the north, the southern nobles, who were now loyal to the Crown Prince, had even taken Asgard Fortress and brought the Evergreen Corridor under their control. Since then, the entire battle on the eastern front had come to an end, and Brando had followed the agreement and sent the White Legion, who had been recuperating in the prisoner camp for many days, out of the Metz area in Bucinian Forest. In fact, the issue of the White Legion's departure had caused quite a stir among the northern nobles. Many people, including Duchess Wayna, thought that these people should be detained until the end of the war, but in the end, the Crown Prince, Lenoret, stood his ground and supported Brando's decision. Count Alcorn and other southern nobles also agreed with the decision. After all, everyone who had participated in the attack plan on that day knew in their hearts that although the White Legion had surrendered in the Battle of Fattarport, they had not really lost their combat power. Keeping them in East Metz was tantamount to a ticking time bomb that could explode at any time. What's more, Count Alcorn also believed that in the civil war of the Empire, their side must maintain a moral advantage, and must not lose the big picture for the small. In the end, his opinion reached a consensus among the northern nobles. Now that Count Alcorn had become Lenoret's right-hand man, he was obviously very satisfied with his current position. He had completely forgotten the scene when he stood on the side of the Silver Queen against Brando. He had repeatedly claimed in public that he and Brando were friends without discord. Brando was speechless about this guy's thick skin. But 2 weeks after the White Legion left Bucinian, bad news came. On the first day of entering Bankel, the White Legion's commander, Duke Ambunal, chose to end his life in a hotel in Gretcher. It was said that he did not leave any will. He only wrote a letter to his family and Her Majesty the Queen. In the letter to the Silver Queen, the Duke expressed his apology for failing to repay the trust of the royal family, detailed his lifelong loyalty and beliefs, and finally tactfully warned the Emperor of the Empire that the undead of Madara were not to be trusted. After receiving the letter, Constance sighed slightly, and then burned it to ashes. Later, she did not punish Ambunal's family for his performance in the war. She only ordered him to be buried solemnly, and then let Duke Ambunal's eldest son inherit his title. Brando did not feel much about Duke Ambunal's death. He only felt a little pity. At least the Duke was an upright person, but the upright people were inevitably tragic. In order to protect the White Legion, the Duke was even willing to compromise with his enemies, but when everything was over, he chose to use his own life to redeem his honor as a soldier. The news of Duke Ambunal's death reached Fathom Port on the third day after the Harvest Festival. At that time, Brando was bored to death, listening to the decision of Prince Leneret and his subordinates. In fact, it had nothing to do with him, because since the middle of this month, Erewhon's people had already withdrawn from the internal struggle of the Empire. Although the fleet from Tonagel was still anchored in Fathom Port, it could actually set off to return to Valhalla at any time. At this moment, the mission of the diplomatic mission had in fact been declared a failure. However, Erewhon's people had gained more than they originally expected. As for how the Holy War would unfold in the future, this ancient kingdom now had more options. And just as Duke Waino was passionately talking about the need to launch a counterattack on the Western Front, the door of the hall was slammed open by a panting Count Alcorn. He brought the news of Duke Ambunal's death, and another news. On the third day after Duke Ambunal's death, the Silver Queen Constance announced a piece of news, in the political center of the empire that she ruled, a grand engagement ceremony was soon to be held. One of the parties involved in the engagement ceremony was the prince from the Latch of Wa, but the other party was greatly unexpected. The bride was not one of Her Majesty's daughters, but the newly conferred Countess of Wallach. About this mysterious countess, in fact, since the day she was conferred the title, there were all kinds of rumors among the people. Some rumors said that she was also a mountain person, while others said that she was not actually a citizen of the empire before she was conferred the title, but came from a state under the empire's rule. Each of these mysterious rumors made people more interested in the countess. In all the areas under the queen's rule, people were discussing the engagement ceremony. For a time, even their military failure in Metz seemed to have been forgotten. The heated discussion caused by the engagement ceremony even spread to Metz, Mehodefen, and Ludwig, which were under the control of the eldest son of the emperor. Although the people were a little quieter, the high-ranking nobles were also discussing the unusual move of the Silver Queen. From the beginning, this marriage was heavily political. It was obvious that it was to appease the mountain people who had just declared their loyalty to the Silver Queen, but what they did not understand was why the other party wanted to make such a big deal out of it. Was it just to cover up the previous military failure? The Cruz people did not understand, but some people knew very well in their hearts. Brando understood that this time, the Prime Minister's daughter was right again. After a brief hesitation, he immediately began to make arrangements. The confrontation between the east and the west of the empire had been formed. Although Leneret's power was not yet stable, it finally had a foothold. He did not intend to let the Erewhon people fight for the throne of the Cruz people, so now it was time to pull back and leave. First, let Eugenie, Enid, and others take the little prince and leave the empire. The mission of the envoy group was over, and the little prince's mission was also over. Although Horus also euphemistically expressed his intention to stay and advance with him after learning that his teacher was going to stay, Brando refuted him with the reason that a king must be responsible for his people. However, looking at the little prince's reluctant eyes, Brando's heart also warmed slightly. Since this diplomatic mission, the former had grown a lot and finally had the temperament of a king. This made him feel very gratified. At least it was worth the danger he experienced in the process. Although there were some troubles left, at least the princess on the battlefield that the soldiers talked about was one of them. He still had not figured out how to explain to Princess Griffine where the missing Princess Fuchsia went. Fortunately, he did not have to face the princess for the time being. Before the fleet left, Brando and Maynard met. After absorbing the war slate that day, the personality of Senior Allium Japonicum fell into a deep sleep and had not woken up yet. No one knew what kind of ability she had gained. Then Maynard's personality took the initiative of the body. As soon as she saw Brando, she gave him a loud slap in the face without saying a word. Then she gritted her teeth and looked at him. Her lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, she did not say anything. But Brando read her lips and read the meaning of this sentence, bitch. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. Of course, he knew that she slapped him because of Senior Allium Japonicum, but it was not his intention. He was also a victim. Fortunately, he felt a little guilty toward this young girl who had inherited his senior sister's soul, so he didn't make a fuss about it. Instead, he found it very interesting to see her face blushing all the way down to her neck after breaking through the cold and unapproachable aura. Miss Maynold, no matter what you think of me, this time, Erwin's domestic affairs are in your hands. Although Erwin seems to be calm now, under the calm like a mirror, there are turbulent undercurrents. Whether it is the royal faction, the Empire, or the undead of Madara, if any of these three parties is not handled well, the kingdom may fall into crisis at any time. Not to mention, All for One will definitely take the opportunity to stir up trouble in this situation. Maynold frowned as if she did not even want to look at him, and replied coldly, I naturally understand, I don't need your unnecessary reminder. But she also understood that among all the ministers under Princess Griffin, only this one in front of her was the clearest about Erwin's future, so she asked, if you have any thoughts, just say it. Brando nodded, satisfied with Maynold's ability to remain calm. Go and tell Her Highness, the undead will definitely start the Second War of the Black Rose within this year. No matter what anyone says to her, don't let her believe it. The Roman Black Rose must give up all hope. Do you know, the royal faction has always thought that you want to use the threat of the undead to expand your influence. Maynold looked at him coldly, you mean to make Her Highness completely oppose it? Those who think so are a bunch of short-sighted people. I believe that there are also people in the royal faction who can see all this clearly. Politics is an art of compromise, Miss Maynold, but not everyone has to compromise. I will pass on the message. Thank you. No need to thank me, this is not for you. Silently watching Maynold board the ship, Brando could not help but touch his cheek. Ouch! He could not help but grit his teeth. This woman really did not hold back at all, it really hurt a little. Although his defense was already beyond ordinary people, it was not able to block out the pain. Besides, Maynold's current strength was not bad at all. After absorbing the second slate, she had already faintly touched the field of elemental power. How is it, does it hurt? At this time, a somewhat teasing voice came from behind him, Count. Brando turned around and found that it was the little princess of House Cypher. Today, Chiara was wearing an exquisite princess dress and holding a purple parasol, looking like a doll. Her two ponytails shone under the golden sun. She raised her small face and looked at Brando with interest, a sly light flashing in her blue eyes from time to time. Princess Cypher of House Cypher, send my regards to your brother. I will, the mischievous little princess replied with a smile. But I have a question for you, Count. Brando made a gesture of invitation. Now you should know what my brother is planning. I just want to ask you, Count, do you plan to marry me? Pfft. Brando almost choked to death. He could not help but cough violently. He had seen many questions that went straight to the point, but this was the first time he had seen such a straightforward question. Especially since the one who asked this question was just a little girl. Although he didn't know how old this little princess was this year, but looking at her underdeveloped chest and her height that only reached his chest when she stood on tiptoe, no matter how he looked at it, she didn't look like she was more than 14 years old. Your Highness. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry as he coughed and replied, let's talk about this question when you are an adult. TSK, Chiara looked at him with disdain, hypocrite, don't think that I don't know the dirty tricks of the nobles. I am a daughter of the royal family, don't you want me? Brando felt that if he continued, someone would call the military police. He quickly interrupted the little brat and said, enough, Your Highness. Humph. Chiara snorted softly and turned her head away, but her small face was tinged with a touch of red. She was a little unconvinced. My brother is better than your washboard princess in every way except for his eyes. And that, Princess Fuchsia, it is better to let him be the king than to let him be. Anyway, there are many people who would like that. Count, don't you know what kind of king Erwin needs? Brando shook his head gently. Miss Chiara, if your brother's surname was Corvado, then he would be an excellent king. The Cipher family also once ruled Erwin. But that was in the past. Miss Chiara, you are a smart girl, you should understand what I am saying. Chiara's eyes were a little gloomy. She bit her lips, as if she was very unconvinced. But with her wisdom, of course she knew that Brando was right. This ancient kingdom could no longer withstand another turmoil. She stood there, frowning and wringing her hands. Brando had never seen such a childish side of this little princess ever since he met her. His heart softened slightly, and he was about to say a few words to comfort her, but he did not expect Chiara to react first. She interrupted him and said, "You don't have to comfort me. I don't want hypocritical comfort from a guy like you. I still have one more thing." Brando was slightly stunned. Chiara lowered her head, put her hands behind her neck, and untied a necklace. She put the necklace in her palm, and then handed it to Brando. "Here, this is the amulet my father gave me. I'll lend it to you for a while, you have to come back alive and return it to me." Brando felt that there was something wrong with her words. He looked at the necklace in his hand, which still had the residual warmth of the little princess's body. It was a beautiful crystal pendant, and it seemed as if there was blood boiling inside. He felt as if he had seen this necklace somewhere before, but he immediately saw the Cipher family emblem engraved on the base of the pendant. Only then did he remember the meaning of this necklace. This was the mark of the royal bloodline. Although he didn't think much of the amulet, Brando didn't expect that she would lend him such a precious thing. He could imagine the thought behind it. He was slightly moved. "Your Highness," he didn't expect Chiara's face to be full of disgust. "Quickly put away that expression that's uglier than crying, it's disgusting. I just don't want to be a widow before I get married." Brando was suddenly speechless. He felt that if he continued to talk to this princess, he might really die of a heart attack. He didn't know where she got these strange ideas from. Where did she receive her noble education? Note 1, the local nickname for the autumn goddess in Metz. Chapter 1054. Scarlet had been having this fragmented dream a lot lately. Inside a tall and spacious Gothic temple, the broken arches and pillars looked like jagged bones floating in the darkness. A giant rose window hung above her head. Sunlight shone through the soft lead, turning it into a mix of amethyst and sapphire, forming a dark and mysterious light that seeped into the darkness. She was fixed on the cold altar, her hands and feet were tightly bound, and there was a strange dagger in her chest that was still dripping with blood. Her life force was slowly fading away. The spacious temple was filled with people, but no matter how much she screamed, no one paid her any attention. There was only one woman chattering beside her. The woman was shrouded in a thick shadow, so Scarlet couldn't see her face or hear what she was mumbling. After a while, the woman suddenly walked forward. Scarlet's eyes widened. She screamed and realized that she was sitting up in bed, drenched in cold sweat. The strange scene around her had long disappeared. The carved bedposts and light muslin curtains melted into the darkness. Not far away, a crystal ornament on the maple desk gave off a faint light. This was still her bedroom. The moonlight that seeped in through the window gently diluted the darkness. Her ponytail had come undone long ago. Strands of fiery red hair stuck to her face. Sweat soaked the blanket and it was cold. Scarlet was stunned for a moment. She hugged herself helplessly and shivered. "You had a nightmare again." Ovina appeared in human form and asked with concern. "Still that dream?" Scarlet nodded. "It must have been hard on you. You must have been under so much pressure recently." "That dream," Ovina shook her head slightly. She bent down to open Scarlet's arms. She looked into her eyes and comforted her. The witches believe that dreams are mirrors of reality. Therefore, there is a saying that dreams and reality are the exact opposite. This dream means that your Lord will come to save you soon. Scarlet looked up. Her clear eyes were filled with a serious questioning look, as if she was asking, "Really?" Ovina couldn't help but laugh. She reached out and scratched her nose. "Of course it's real. Have I ever lied to you?" C looked at her suspiciously. Ovina blushed, which was a rare sight. She sighed and said, all right. Let's not talk about the cake I tricked you out of last time. That was just an accident. Why are you such a vengeful human girl?" "Because, it's very important," CIA said in a very small voice. "This matter is very important to you, I understand. But do you still trust your Lord?" Qian nodded without hesitation. Ovina couldn't help but stare at her in shock. What a lucky guy. She sighed almost imperceptibly. "Since you're so sure that your Lord will come to save you, what else do you have to worry about?" "I'm worried. My Lord." "Silly child." Ovina's heart softened and she patted her shoulder. "You're still worrying about others at a time like this. Don't worry, that guy will be fine." As if she had accepted Ovina's consolation, Scarlet finally calmed down a little. "Ovina, what time is it?" she asked. She felt like she had slept for a long time and her head was heavy. "Cheer up," Ovina answered. "It's dawn, Scarlet." The carriage creaked as it rocked back and forth. Behind the hood of the carriage was the autumn scenery of the outskirts of Bank Field. The dazzling golden light dyed the boundless land, and the horizon was dotted with farmhouses and windmills. Rolling clouds piled up to form the shape of mountains and rivers, and the wind pushed them forward slowly. The leaves of the tall spruce poplar trees on both sides of the road rustled. Sunlight shone through the branches of the trees, creating a scene of autumn. But no one in the carriage was in the mood to enjoy this rare scenery. The second-hand carriage swayed uncontrollably as it moved forward, as if it would break apart at any moment. The interior of the carriage was dark and dim. Bits and pieces of light shone through the holes in the hood and fell on the faces of Brando and the others, who all had different expressions on their faces. "Who on earth bought this carriage?" Vahina's face was pale. She couldn't help but ask the question. Before she could finish, she couldn't help but cover her mouth. Her chest churned and she rolled her eyes, almost throwing up again. But there was only acid left in her stomach. She had thrown up all her breakfast, including the red wine stewed beef and baked trout she had eaten the night before. The others were a little better, but they couldn't help but feel a little worried when they saw the young lady. "Hey Pamela." Brendel's expression was a little ugly. Although his physique was far superior to that of a normal person, this carriage was a little too much. More importantly, he had seen at least 3 rivets happily jumping off the pillars of the carriage so far. The whole carriage was as if it was possessed, clanking and clanking. Only God knew when it would fall apart in the next moment. There was still a long way to go before they reached the capital of the empire. Without the carriage, they would have to walk for at least a day. But it was already past noon and the nearest inn was more than 20 miles away. "I'm sorry," the priestess looked very awkward under everyone's stares. She answered helplessly, "Because it's cheap. The goddess taught us, it's good to be thrifty." Brando couldn't help but sigh. "But you've been fooled. How is this a second-hand car? This carriage is almost scrapped. And those 2 horses, with Martha on top, I can't bear to let them continue to pull the carriage. If the Animal Protection Association, well, I mean the Druids, if those guys see this, I'm afraid trouble will come knocking on our door. What's there to worry about a bunch of people playing with grass?" Andrique replied nonchalantly. "If they dare to come, I'll dare to kill them." Brando glared at her. The vampire's sibling strength had just recovered to the state of elemental awakening. He didn't know where they got their confidence from. "I'm sorry." Hippamra apologized very sincerely. However, not everyone was frowning. At least beside the vampire princess, Morpheus's attention was completely focused on the rays of sunlight that penetrated through the holes in the roof of the carriage. The spots of light fell on the tip of his nose, making it look like faint freckles. The vampire youth, who was even more beautiful than the girl, was concentrating on counting the holes in the roof of the carriage. He was completely focused on counting the number of holes in the roof of the carriage. He was muttering under his breath, but no one knew if he had counted to 71 or 72. On the other side, Brando saw the Roman who was secretly laughing happily. Noticing Brando's frown and looking over, Romain replied guiltily and breathlessly, "Heh heh heh. Brando, if you had let me show up earlier, heh heh heh. It wouldn't be so troublesome." "Oh, my stomach, ha 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 ha, this carriage is actually very interesting, isn't it?" Ouch! Before she could finish her sentence, Brando pinched her face. Brendel frowned as he looked at the guy who was gloating over his misfortune. This guy had sneaked off the ship again. It was fine that he didn't settle the score with her, but now he actually dared to walk into the muzzle of the gun. He was simply asking for death. Ouch, ouch, ouch. Roman tilted her body and was in so much pain that tears were about to fall. Boo. Brando, I was wrong. What were you wrong about? I shouldn't have said that it was very interesting when I was very serious. As a merchant, you should at least have the ability to observe people's expressions. Yes. I shouldn't have sneaked off the ship. Brando couldn't help but stare at her coldly before letting go of his hand. He knew very well that she wanted to stay with him regardless of the danger. He was touched, but this kind of undisciplined action was too lawless. It wasn't the first time she had done it, and she refused to change. After the Roman escaped from the clutches of the demon, she hurriedly shrank behind Metasha like a frightened rabbit. There, she frowned and stared at him with a very unhappy look. Metasha smiled helplessly. "My lord, don't worry. The Shire used magic to maintain the carriage. It won't be a problem to last until the outskirts of Rushte." Miss Roman was asked to stay by Lady Mithril. This time, it's not entirely her fault. Brando frowned. The Silver Dragon had finally left the convoy 2 days ago. Before that, she had proposed to let Roman stay, but he didn't agree. Disguising as a caravan required a person who was truly knowledgeable, but he knew that this disguise wasn't really to fool the Silver Queen. It was just to reduce the trouble on the road. Besides, Delphian had also managed the business of the Nydevan family, so she could be considered knowledgeable. But he always felt that Mithril had a deeper meaning. Otherwise, she wouldn't have smiled and not answered his question. Now that he thought about it, the Silver Dragon might have known that the Roman had secretly used witchcraft to hide in the convoy. She might even have helped. What Brando couldn't figure out was why she did this. But now it seems that at least part of Lady Mithril's suggestion is very reasonable. The Shire suddenly smiled and helped Romain out of her predicament. Opposite him, Delphine, the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Empire, blushed slightly, but she did not refute. She only turned her head away silently. She was in charge of the family's business activities, but in fact, she was only responsible for the general direction and determining the strategic intentions. As for the minor details, she had capable servants to help her complete them. A few days ago, she confidently told Brando that she was fully qualified for this position, but in reality, in the end, when she arrived at the prosperous market of 11 Leaves City, Delphian was at a loss as to how to buy a second-hand carriage. She knew the prices of commodities in the sublime inland sea and the future trend of the autumn and summer. She knew every detail of the burning, storage, transportation, and sale of charcoal in Cloak Bay. She knew when to stock up on goods and how to deal with the most powerful merchants in the empire. But she didn't know how to bargain with a skinny second-hand dealer who looked a bit like a monkey. In fact, she had offended the seller completely with just a few words. In the end, Hipamra had to bite the bullet and spend a lot of money to buy a second-hand carriage back. Which was this old carriage in front of them. Vahina was still vomiting by the side of the carriage, and the inside of the carriage fell into an awkward situation. Brando shook his head. Who could he blame? Hipamra had done well enough. Before she was summoned as a card, she was originally an inexperienced girl. Most of the priests of Gaia were ascetics, and it was likely that she had never left the temple before. He lowered his head and refocused his attention on the metal fragments in his hand. These fragments were originally part of the flaming blade, and with Sydney's help, he could gradually feel that they were resonating with the soul of Odorfice in his body. It seemed that reactivating the flaming blade was just as Sydney had said, it was only a matter of time. But with the awakening of the soul of Odorfice, there was something that made him feel a little strange. At the same time when he awakened the soul of Odorfice, he felt that he was touching two other laws in the elemental realm. One was hot and unrestrained, like a raging fire, and the other was deep and despairing, like the darkness of the abyss. He did not know whether this was an illusion or not, but these two laws were quietly increasing the power and realm of his main laws. In just 2 weeks, he felt that he had already faintly touched the true meaning of the Edict of Truth. This was actually a sign of reaching the peak of a realm. This fact scared him. In his memory, the elemental realm could only be increased gradually. In the game, the experience at this level would be converted into the power of order, and if he wanted to increase his level, he had to continuously complete missions and find opportunities to advance. For the natives, it was even more tragic. Usually, they could only increase their realm by understanding the laws. It was common for people like Veronica and Mephisto to be stuck in a realm for decades. At least Brando had never heard of any external force that could help to increase the realm of the elemental realm. He wasn't sure if it was an illusion, or if it was because the other half of his soul that belonged to Sophie was different from this world, so he didn't dare to tell Sydney this secret for the time being. He could only wait for time to prove everything. Do you want to know more about the Amber Sword? Open WeChat now, click on the plus sign at the top right, choose to add a public account, search for Kitty and Hongwenwang, follow the public account, and never miss a new update. Chapter 1055. The Debo River sparkled under the setting sun. Every time this happened, the sunset glow floating on the surface of the river would shoot into the window, dyeing the hotel hall crimson. Through the window lattice, one could see the imperial capital standing on the horizon. It was a majestic shadow. The high tower and the city walls left a thick shadow in the setting sun. After wiping the last table, Seti stood up and wiped her sweat with the back of her hand. She looked at the door with surprise. The light at the door dimmed, and a few cloaked travelers walked in. They were guests. Seti was surprised that there would be guests at this time of the year. Since the war in Metz, the number of merchants on the road had decreased. The business of the hotel was getting worse and worse. The owner of the hotel even decided to close for the time being. The first person to walk in was a foreigner. He had long dark brown hair that was rarely seen in the Empire. His face was somewhat handsome. Although it couldn't be said that one would fall in love with him at first sight, at least his facial features were well-defined and handsome. His brown eyes contained a divine light, and his expression was filled with warmth. It was as if one would feel a sense of familiarity at first glance. Behind him, there was a taller man who seemed to be his companion. He looked even more handsome and wore a hood. Although he took it off as soon as he entered the house, revealing his slightly curly short hair that reached his ears. He looked around with a cynical look in his eyes. Behind him were a few girls. Seti could not help but feel strange. Who would bring so many girls with them at this time of the year? She could not help but suspect that they were a group of slave traders. However, she quickly realized that she was mistaken. These girls were obviously not simple. Just the look in the eyes of some of them made her not dare to look at them directly. She had only seen this kind of aggressive temperament from the real big shots in the city. How could they be female slaves? What a strange caravan. Seti noticed the caravan parked outside the hotel. Only traveling merchants would use this kind of caravan to travel to and from the bank district. The people who entered the hotel were Brando and his companions. Thankfully, the old caravan they bought from 11-Leaf Town had safely arrived at their destination before it fell apart. It was the hotel with the name Cat and Beard written on the signboard. Not more than 10 miles from Rushta, this old Renaissance building stood on the banks of the Silver Bridge of Holy Waters. It was plain on the outside, except that it was a little too shabby. The paint on the sign and door was peeling badly, and the roof was patched up in many places. But the windows were bright and clean, and there were a few pots of ivy on the windowsill beside the door. They were well taken care of by its owner. The inn's business seemed to be very quiet, probably because of its remote location. Delphine mentioned that this was the farthest inn from the east gate of Rushta. Only some merchants who did not have much money would stay here temporarily. However, this was the reason why they chose this hotel. Seclusion meant safety. The waitress of this inn was actually a mountain girl. Her long hair was as red as fire under the setting sun, and he was a little surprised. But when they went up the stairs, Seal turned back and said with a smile, "It looks like the little girl is suspicious, so it's just as Lady Sydney said, our disguise isn't very good." Brando came back to his senses and replied, "This is what I expected. I thought you would be troubled by this, my lord." "I won't be troubled by useless things. I just don't want to do useless things." "What do you mean by useless things?" The Shire sighed. "It's been a while since I heard a new word from you, my lord." Brando slapped his mouth in annoyance. "It's meaningless things." At this time, the Roman who was walking in front was paying attention to their conversation. Of course, she had been eavesdropping on their conversation. She had long forgotten about her anger at Brando in the carriage. When she heard this sentence, she could not help but deliberately fall behind and asked with her eyes wide open. "But how can it be meaningless? If Her Majesty catches us, will she hang us on the gallows? I heard that the nobles treat their prisoners like this. If that's the case, should we disguise ourselves or something?" "Because it's useless." Delphine, who was walking by the side, answered. Ever since she started taking the spring water, the scars on her face had faded quite a bit. At least, she didn't look so hideous anymore. Some parts of her face had even started to shed, revealing the new skin that was as smooth as mud and fat. Most importantly, she no longer needed to rely on the wheelchair to move. Although she still had some mobility issues, at least she could move freely like a normal person. Useless. Brando nodded. "When we were on the road, did the patrolling knight not stop to check on us when they passed by us? Isn't that a good thing? The key lies in the frequency. We've encountered too many patrolling knights along the way. As far as I know, such knights would only do a routine patrol around the periphery of the imperial capital in the early morning and before the evening on normal days. This means that Her Majesty the Queen has strengthened the security around the imperial capital, but she did not order them to check on the floating population entering Rushta." "Is that so?" "Yes." Delphine nodded, but she glanced at Brando with some surprise. She did not expect him to be so familiar with this place. After all, many natives of Rushta did not know how the security around the imperial capital worked. The Shire smiled, apparently already knowing the answer to this question. "This means that the hospitable Her Majesty the Queen has implemented a method of security. It seems that she is very confident in her tentacles. She is only afraid that we will not enter the city. In other words, as long as we enter the city, she will be able to find us." Brando nodded. "At least that's what the Silver Queen thinks." Romaine analyzed what she had learned and could not help but frown. If that's the case, Brando, should we split up? That means, let me bring Brunhilde and the others into the city to attract the Queen's attention. You and Teacher Mephisto find a way to sneak into the city to save Scarlet. Brando could not help but feel angry and amused at the same time. He patted her on the forehead. What are you thinking? Things are not that bad yet. I don't think the Silver Queen will make things difficult for us so soon. Roman hurriedly covered his forehead and dodged backwards, asking, why? I don't know why. Brando shook his head and replied softly, but I have a feeling that the Silver Queen is waiting for us to enter the city. After the sun had set below the horizon, the curtain of night had truly enveloped Rushta. In the darkness, specks of light floated up and down like stars in the distant horizon. Further away, flashes of light flashed across the pitch-black sky from time to time. Only those who lived in Rushta knew that it was actually the ornithopter of the Nazar people. As Rushta was near the border of the Nazar people, both sides had a large number of troops stationed at the eastern border. Even under the night sky, there were still groups of Pegasus night and magic-guided ornithopters patrolling the crisscrossing sky. Vahina stood by the window and stared at the quietly flowing river under the moonlight. She could not help but recall the scene of the last time she came to the imperial capital. Things had changed with the passage of time, and she had fallen from the status that was revered by the people to the clouds. Forget about maintaining the glory of the past, even her father and brother were imprisoned in the belly of this terrifying beast in front of her. But she did not know why, but at this moment, her heart was calm. Knock 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 suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Everyone in the room turned around and saw Medusa pushing open the door and entering the room in her martial attire. She closed the door behind her and breathed a sigh of relief before looking at Brendel. My lord. Medusa, how is it? Brando nodded at her. He had sent her out to gather information, and from her expression, she seemed to have found something. Medusa replied, it's all right, it's not too troublesome. My lord, the engagement ceremony will be held half a month later. At that time, there will be a banquet in the Garden of the White Rose in the St. Cantifer Palace. There will also be a celebration in the city. In fact, Rushta has been preparing for this since a week ago. Brando could not help but snort coldly. Obviously, he was very disdainful of what Cruz had done to Scarlet. It seems that the Silver Queen wants to use this to dilute the atmosphere in the imperial capital. But I don't think it will be effective. She doesn't even think about what she has done before. It's just to get rid of the dissidents. Delphian replied calmly. Medusa could not help but look at the Prime Minister's daughter. She frowned slightly before continuing her report. Countess Scarlet, is said to be living in a castle outside of Rushta. But when I went to see the place, it was empty. Is it fake news, or has she been moved? Brando asked. She should have been moved, my lord. I was worried that the Silver Queen had left some spies in the vicinity, so I did not dare to stay for too long. But later on, I asked around and found out that there was indeed an important person who lived in the castle before, but they moved out a few weeks ago. It seems that the Silver Queen has already predicted our arrival. Otherwise, she would not have to do this. Delphian was indifferent to Medusa's gaze and analyzed with a calm voice. Brendel did not answer, but he did not have any objections. He had already expected this, and Amandina's analysis was exactly the same as well. What about the others? He asked again. Medusa turned her head. Miss Delphian, your father and grandfather are imprisoned in the Moss Castle. The commander of the Azure Army and the Duke of Flower Leaf are also imprisoned. But as far as I know, the higher-ups of the Holy Cathedral are not imprisoned there. As for the whereabouts of the Great Cathedral, not many people know. Many people do not seem to know what happened in the Holy Cathedral that day, nor do they know that the Holy Cathedral of Fire has now been divided into two. Hearing this, the Saintess of the Leo Palace, Sydney, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, frowned slightly. Phaina showed an anxious expression. Medisha, the Moss Castle is not a special prison, Delphian interrupted her, that is the palace of the royal family, so they are only under house arrest. After all, my father, grandfather, and the Duke of Flowerleaf did not stand out to openly oppose the Silver Queen. What about that person? Why are they being arrested? Romaine was counting the expenses of the recent days, and could not help but raise her head and ask curiously when she heard this. Because they did not immediately express their stance. The Silver Queen is going to do something too big this time. For safety reasons, she will first suppress all unstable factors to the minimum. Miss Delphine, Melissa's dissatisfaction became more obvious when she heard Delphine's words. According to what you said, I don't see any reason for you to choose his lordship. What the Silver Queen needs is the attitude of the House of Nydivan, and you represent the attitude of the House of Nydivan. I don't know what you're planning, but if you dare to harm his lordship, the Silver Fairy Princess pursed her lips and did not finish her sentence. But looking at her cold eyes, Delphian knew what she was going to say next. Brando was also slightly startled, and could not help but look at Medisha with some surprise. He knew that Medisha had never truly accepted this daughter of the Prime Minister, but this was the first time she had made her stance so clear. Delphian smiled, and only raised her head to look at Brando with her light purple eyes. She did not answer. Miss Delphian. Brando could not help but speak. Does the Count not trust me? But you do have more choices, don't you? The Shire finally interjected, choosing to side with Medisha. Delphian could not help but gently shake her head. Brando sighed. It's because of the change in the Ivy League, right? The Prime Minister's daughter turned her head with a "you knew it" look on her face. She hesitated for a moment, and then nodded gently, but that is only one of the reasons. My grandfather never supported the late Emperor to pass the throne to the Silver Queen, so His Majesty supported the Pallet family to counterbalance the power of the Prime Minister. They used this method once when the royal family fought against the Holy Cathedral, but this time it was not as good as the last time. The change in the Ivy League, Mephistopheles, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke. Is it referring to that matter? Everyone's eyes were on him. I just happen to know. Mephistopheles, you're not a revenant from Madara. Brando only then realized that he did not know much about the vampire siblings. He knew about the past of Medisha, the Shire, the Nightsong Tiger, and Falerne. Even Hippamra would occasionally mention some of her experiences in the Holy Cathedral of Earth, but Mephistopheles and Endrique had always been tight-lipped about their origins. Before this, he had always thought that before they became card creatures, they were just ordinary dark nobles from Madara, or perhaps they had some background. But when he heard Mephistopheles' words, he knew that he was wrong. Mephistopheles was not a revenant from Madara. He was most likely born in Metz, or else he would not have known about what happened back then. Mephistopheles looked at him and nodded. My lord, you guessed right. My sister and I are not dark nobles from Madara. We were from Cruz when we were alive, and Metz was our hometown. So it wasn't a coincidence that I summoned all of you out of the tomb that day. Brendel nodded. I don't know much about the laws of the Cards of Fate, but perhaps that is the case. I understand, Brando replied, since you were once from Metz, then you must have personally experienced that incident back then. Not exactly, but my sister Endrique and I did go through that dark period of history. I only remember that my family and friends died in that turmoil, even myself. That period of history was even crueler than the narration. Sir John Morrison's experience was just the tip of the iceberg. Mephistopheles smiled faintly. I really don't want to recall too much about that period of history. If it wasn't for my lord mentioning it, I wouldn't have even brought it up. I'm sorry. Brando did not expect that he would accidentally reopen a scar and could not help but feel apologetic. It's all right, my lord. Time will heal all scars. Mephistopheles smiled. It was after the Holy War, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire was facing a general decline of faith and confusion. The undead and the cultists took advantage of the situation and stirred up trouble within the empire. The Holy Cathedral of Fire was most heavily infiltrated by All for One during that period, and there are still many historical problems left behind. I remember that during the most chaotic period, East Metz and Mihotefen, which are close to Argean, bore the brunt of the attack. There were even a few dukes who were bewitched. I heard about it, Vahina suddenly spoke. I heard from my wet nurse about the scene at that time. It was said that many people died at that time. Countless people were crucified every day, and the nobles were also full of assassinations and conspiracies. That was the darkest period of the Metz region. The countryside was the territory of the witches and heretics. They pulled out the tendons of the people and skinned them, using the harshest methods to torture the priests and believers of the Holy Cathedral. It was the same in the cities. Every day, there were witches being burned at the stake. Similar scenes were happening all the time. Mephistopheles recalled the scene at that time and could not help but frown. I never thought that such a thing would happen in the Empire. The Shire was a little surprised. Although he had heard of the turmoil, he did not experience it for himself. He could not imagine how serious it was. What happened after that? After that, it was the so-called Ivy League Rebellion. The chaos in East Metz turned into a real turmoil. Several famous nobles died in the chaos, and some of them were comrades and close friends of Nidevan's who had fought side by side with him. Sydney spoke at this time. As a person involved in the Holy Cathedral, she could be said to be the one who knew what happened the most. In a fit of rage, the old chancellor was ordered by the Silver Queen to lead the army into East Metz and quell the rebellion in one fell swoop. He even captured 2 of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. 2. Brando noticed the number. The Lord of Filthy Blood, Lochlear, and the Withered Whip, Laney. But the latter escaped during the process of being escorted. He escaped, but my grandfather always suspected that Her Majesty let him go. Delphian finally spoke. At that time, Her Majesty and my grandfather had a great disagreement on how to deal with the cultists. In fact, according to the law of the Holy Cathedral, the cultists should have been beheaded long ago. But the last one escaped, and the last one is still imprisoned in the Thorn Fortress. Most of the cultists and fallen Dark Lords were only sealed and not completely destroyed. Sir John Laurie's son was just one of them. This was the order given by the Silver Queen herself. She sighed. What puzzled my grandfather the most was that the Holy Cathedral actually backed down. This matter sowed a grudge between Her Majesty and my grandfather. But not just because of personal reasons, but because my grandfather saw that Her Majesty had other intentions. Although he was not biased towards the Holy Cathedral, but as a veteran of the imperial faction, he did not want to see the imperial family and the Holy Cathedral truly break apart, and thus lead the empire to eternal damnation. She took a light breath and said, "So everyone should understand now. Now that everything has happened, it's even more impossible for my grandfather to stand with Her Majesty. This is also the reason why Her Majesty secretly plotted to make me leave the capital. I should have seen through this long ago, but I was blinded by hatred." Me too. Vahina looked at Brando and gritted her teeth. "I can represent Mihotefen, Brando. I will stand on your side. I am the first in line to inherit Flower Leaf territory. I can make this promise. Miss Vahina." Medisha looked at her and comforted her. "Don't worry, we are not targeting you." "Thank you, Medisa." Her Royal Highness of Flower Collar couldn't help but blush. Delphian ignored Medisha's words. She turned to Brando and asked, "So my lord, what should we do next?" "There is still half a month," Brando replied. "Seems like there is still plenty of time. We will do our best to find out where Scarlet is being held. I will only consider launching an attack on the day of the celebration if there is no other choice. But before that, we need to find a way to invade Tessberg. On one hand, we need to save your and Vahina's loved ones. On the other hand, we need to gain more allies. He glanced at Sydney. It would be best if we can find out where the Holy Cathedral's higher-ups are being held. Will they be killed by Her Majesty? The Shire suddenly interrupted. She will not do that, the Lion Palace's Saintess finally spoke. Before we obtain the Holy Sword Odorfice, then let's do that. We will split up and investigate, Brando replied. Even though the Silver Queen is confident that she will be able to find us, we still have time to play hide-and-seek with her. He paused for a moment. I will give her a surprise. Chapter 1056. P.S. If you want to hear more of your voices and receive more of your suggestions, please search for Dread on WeChat and follow it. Give more support to The Amber Sword. Brando and the Shire walked aimlessly on Fragrant Street. It was the busiest commercial district in the imperial capital. The high-rise buildings on both sides of the street were hung with curtains representing the celebration. The craftsmen were making tables full of flowers and fine wine from the manors in the suburbs. The entire street seemed to be immersed in the atmosphere of the upcoming celebration, but upon closer inspection, one would notice some incongruous details. Few smiles could be seen on the faces of the pedestrians. Apart from the carefree children, almost everyone's face was more or less filled with sadness. It seemed that the heated discussion about Countess Latch's marriage had not really made people forget the war on the front lines. For those with a certain amount of assets, the war showed that their money was decreasing, but for those who lived in the imperial capital, or even the entire Bancal area to the Cloak Bay area, the war made their already poor lives even more difficult. Prices skyrocketed, supplies were reduced, men were forcibly transferred to the army, and the remaining people were almost unable to get by. The cost of the war was inevitably passed on to these people, and only a few could reap benefits or realize their ambitions. It looks like Her Majesty the Queen of the Kurlutzians isn't having a good time either. Charles looked around and couldn't help but comment. Brando nodded silently. But they were not here to comment on the Silver Queen situation at the moment. Under his suggestion, everyone began to act separately. Vahina, Delphian, and the Roman disguised themselves as merchants. The Mihodafen family had a lot of influence in the imperial capital, and their remaining forces in the dark had been trying to rescue the Duke of Flowers in recent months. Vahina's task was to contact these people. Delphian's situation was similar. The Nidwin family's enemies were all over the court, but they also had many staunch allies. Some of these allies had suffered losses in the war, while some had avoided the limelight but were not trusted by the Silver Queen. There were always people who could be trusted among them, and the Prime Minister's daughter had to identify them one by one. Their mission was to distinguish between friend and foe, and rope in potential allies. This mission had a certain degree of danger, but if it was done well, they would not be deaf and blind in this huge city. As for Medisha and the rest, their task was to contact the Antiburo Duchy's envoy that had entered the city a day earlier, and confirm if Princess Magadal had already contacted them. This was a hidden move. Erwin's envoy had sided with the Crown Prince in this civil war, so their mission was declared over after the war in Metz. But this had nothing to do with Princess Magadal. She was the representative of the Antiburo Duchy, and at least for now, the duchy was still on the Silver Queen's side. So after the war ended, she still had to go to the imperial capital to meet up with her envoy. However, the nun princess did not support the Silver Queen in her heart, because she was a staunch traditionalist. With the direct descendant of the Great Sanctum, Sydney, on Brando's side, she would naturally side with Brando. Not to mention, the latter was her savior. Of course, she would not betray the interests of her country, but on this basis, she could provide some help to Brando and the rest. At least, she could be another eye for them, to prevent the two-faced nobles of Cruz from deceiving them. At the same time, she could also provide cover for them to enter and leave the city. Even though it was impossible for the Silver Queen to not keep an eye on the nun princess who was close to the people of Aween, that was not important. This city was filled with her spies, and if she was afraid of being discovered, she would not be able to achieve anything. In fact, Brando, who was very experienced in this kind of infiltration mission, don't ask where his experience came from, knew very well that it was not terrible to be discovered by Her Majesty. What was terrible was that the information was not equal. As for his own mission and the mission of the Shire, he did not mention it, but it was very important. He first walked around the city by himself, exploring all the places with hidden events and items in his memory. After all, it was rare for him to come to Lushta, and it was uncertain whether he would come here again in the future. He did not intend to leave the hidden places and treasures for the people of Cruz. After half a day, he had obtained a lot of things. Among them, he had obtained dozens of bottles of holy water No. 2 and holy water No. 3. Because most of the hidden places near the imperial capital were tombs or shrines, the easiest things to obtain in these places were all kinds of holy water and holy items. Although he inherited a lot of holy water from Amon's inheritance, after going through many battles, he had used up most of the high-end goods. This time, his harvest greatly supplemented his high-end collection. After all, the imperial capital was also the center of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so the holy water produced in these places would not be ordinary. As for holy items, they were relatively rare in the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so most of the things he obtained were the most common goods, such as blessed prayer beads, holy bones, and similar things. These things could provide a lot of bonus to holy spells when fighting against demons and undead, but they were not useful on normal days. The only thing that pleased Brando was that he obtained the armor of Gundo and angelic wings from the tomb of Saint Fortuna. Saint Fortuna was a famous saint in the history of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but the location of his holy body was a mystery for thousands of years. This mystery was finally solved by a Cruz player from Cloak Bay, who accidentally found the tomb of the saint in the public cemetery of the Lion's Sacred Palace. From there, he obtained the armor of Gundo and the angelic wings that the saint used when he was alive. This discovery was also a widely circulated anecdote in the Amber Sword, because before this, most of the hidden treasures and discoveries were found in remote places. Very few people would look for lost treasures under the watchful eyes of the novice village. After all, most people's first impression would be that there would be no hidden treasures in their birthplace, or even if there were, it would only be some trivial Easter eggs. However, the discovery of the armor of Gundo and the angelic wings taught everyone a lesson. It proved that in the Amber Sword, the location of hidden treasures was only related to their history. In other words, in theory, as long as the game's historical background was in line with the game's history, you could even unearth the azure lance at the birthplace. After that, there was a wave of historical investigation and background exploration in the game. It was also at that time that players like Brando began to deliberately record a lot of history and information. It was worth mentioning that the tomb of Gerald and Butchie was also discovered in this context. The reason why the tomb of Fortuna was so famous, other than the background, was because of the armor of Gundo and the angelic wings that the player found. Of these two holy items, the lower value of the armor of stiffness was a fantasy-grade equipment, while the angelic wings was a genuine ancient artifact, even close to the quality of a divine artifact. Although the armor of Gundo was called armor, it was actually a pair of gloves made of an unknown silver metal. In addition to the amazing attributes of this pair of gloves, strength plus 35, constitution plus 40, 10% light resistance, as a fantasy-grade armor, it also had a special effect that made everyone envious. As long as there was light, the wearer could activate the special ability Gundo's Shelter. This ability was actually an invincible barrier that lasted for 5 seconds, had a radius of about 10 meters, and could not be moved. That's right. It was immune to all damage and control effects, lasted for 5 seconds, and took about 4 hours to recharge. Although it could not be moved, if used well, it could be used to turn the tide of battle. At that time, when the Amber Sword was still in the era of major dungeons, this item was once recognized as a bugged equipment. The player who owned it was in a guild that was far ahead of the world in terms of PvE progress. This caused many protests from players, but later on, as more and more fantasy-grade equipment appeared in the world, various bugged special effects emerged, and the voices of controversy disappeared. After all, bugged equipment was called a divine artifact when one person had it, but when everyone had a divine artifact, it was just a so-so. But if the armor of stiffness was just a so-so, then the holy robe of angelic wings was a little hard to accept, especially when it was in the early stages of the game, and was obtained by players almost effortlessly from a newbie map. This holy robe on the surface was a typical robe of a priest, but because it was discovered in the version where the ancient robe was not released yet, its attributes that were far beyond the standard of fantasy-grade equipment, will plus 21, Bloodline plus 110, Light Affinity plus 10, were shocking to players at that time. Although the players of that era were not clear about the existence of higher-tier equipment after fantasy grade, they still gave this holy robe an appropriate title, Super Fantasy Equipment. Later on, when the Ancient Robe was released, the Angelic Wings was directly promoted to Ancient Robe. It could be said that it could be said to be the only ancient robe in the whole of the Amber Sword that players had witnessed the promotion process, and its fame in the Amber Sword was imaginable. But that was not the main point. The main point was the special attribute of the Angelic Wings, Feather of Light. Your Light Affinity attribute can be converted to Wind Affinity attribute. This attribute was unknown to players for as long as 3 versions, because in the early version, Elemental Affinity was in fact a kind of attribute enhancement. In short, it was to increase the proficiency of casting a certain type of spell, including damage, casting speed, elemental penetration, and so on. It sounded very powerful, but the actual effect was very deceptive. Because the affinity attribute was calculated according to the affinity level, and the affinity level had an EXP slot. The affinity level would increase according to the proficiency of the EXP slot, and the affinity level would increase according to the elemental affinity provided by equipment or skills. In this way, the 10% increase in damage, casting speed, and elemental penetration for each affinity level seemed to be of little value. After all, a player could not pile up thousands of elemental affinity points. If that was the case, what other attributes would they have? Because of this reason, and in addition to the fact that most of the wearers of the Holy Robe were priests, how many of the priests' holy spells other than the Holy Cathedral of the Wind Empress required wind affinity? Even the priests of the Wind Empress spent most of their time dealing with the light element. This was the basic principle of holy spells. Although the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire used all kinds of flames, it was actually just the light element's representation of the doctrine of the path of metal and fire. In Wound, as long as it was a holy spell, it would definitely not be separated from the light element. Because of this, most players thought that the Feather of Light was just a useless ability, and that the only reason the Angelic Wings had this ability was to balance out the high basic attributes of the Angelic Wings. In fact, until the end of War and Chaos, players still thought that the main strength of the Angelic Wings was its superior attributes. After all, the title of a blank divine artifact was not just for show. However, with the appearance of the heirloom, more heirloom items began to appear in the eyes of the players. Gradually, the players began to realize that among the many heirloom items, the Angelic Wings attributes were actually just a so-so, and not even first-rate. Because of this, it was inevitable that the players would question, if the basic attributes of a piece of equipment were only average among the same tier, and its special attributes were trash, could it really be considered an heirloom item? Some players thought that this was a bug in the game company, while others began to suspect that there was something more to the Feather of Light. In the end, they really did research on it. In the era of the Slate War, the players began to grasp the power of extremity. After entering their own world of laws, the players began to be surprised to find that the laws were inclined towards the elements. This was actually very normal, after all, the entire world was built on the basis of the elements. Martha and the 4 great elven kings made a contract to use the elements as the foundation of the world, and then used the laws to restrict the flow of mana to create this world where all living beings lived. Therefore, the entire world and the laws that were built on it would inevitably be inclined towards the elements. Just like the Holy Cathedral of Fire built by the Flame King Gretel, and the Holy Cathedral of Wind built by the Wind Empress, their doctrines were all closely related to the elements, and the beliefs of the 4 great holy cathedrals were all one of the most fundamental laws of this world. Therefore, the laws that were inclined towards the elements were, in fact, shown in the background of the game from the very beginning. This was not surprising, but what shocked the players was that elemental affinity was also effective in the world of laws. And this effect was not only reflected in the strength of the elements, it could even change the nature of the elements. In other words, if a player's element power was a breeze, or a similar law that leaned towards the wind, under the influence of elemental affinity, it could even become a gale or a hurricane. This increase was not only a quantitative increase, but also a qualitative increase. Under such circumstances, the Wings of Light was extremely terrifying. This was because it could turn an element that leaned towards the light into a pure element that leaned towards the wind. Unfortunately, most of the cleric's elements were more or less inclined towards the light. In other words, with this holy robe, it was equivalent to having mastered 2 elements at the same time, one leaning towards the light element, and the other leaning towards the wind element. This was simply heaven-defying. It was equivalent to saying that if Brando's spacetime element leaned towards the light element, after the conversion of this holy robe, he could completely obtain a similar element that leaned towards the wind element. For example, the element of nirvana, which was not inferior to the spacetime element. Although these 2 elements belonged to the same level, their effects were completely different. For someone who mastered these 2 elements at the same time, the increase in strength was not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. As soon as this fact was exposed, the angelic wings immediately returned to the throne of godly equipment, and even received the title of godly equipment. The reason why it was not a godly equipment was that it had extremely high requirements for the wearer's own quality. This was very easy to understand. A guy who only had the most secondary element wearing this holy robe could only be a rookie no matter how much it was converted. Therefore, this equipment was icing on the cake, and could not achieve the effect of sending charcoal in snowy weather. In theory, this holy robe was indeed the most suitable for Brando. After all, what element could be of a higher level than spacetime? Could it be more powerful than the spacetime element of the same quality? Unfortunately, the spacetime element being a light element was only an assumption. In fact, it was a dark element in wound, so this equipment had no effect on it at all. Brando had actually prepared this equipment for Hippamra. Without a doubt, there was no one under him who was more suitable for this holy robe than Hippamra. Hippamra's element was a very high-level law of light and earth, holy white land. After converting it into the wind element of the same quality, it was almost equivalent to having 3 elements. Holy White Land's main function was defense and support, and most of the wind element was more offensive, so it complemented each other. After getting these things, Brando summoned the Shire. After all, he found a few hidden treasures in every place he went. This kind of bizarre thing was not easy to explain, so he could only find an excuse to send Seal away to do something else. Once he was done with his personal matters, he would summon Seal back. Anyway, the Planeswalker system had almost no distance restrictions. With just a command, he could summon the person with secondary authority to his side at any time. His next destination was Suman Street. At the end of the street, there was a magic item shop called Indulgent Rose, and this unknown little place was the final destination of his trip. My novel, The Amber Sword, will have more fresh content on the official WeChat platform, and there's a 100% chance of a lucky draw gift for everyone. Open WeChat now, click the plus sign at the top right to add friend, search for the public account, Dread, and follow. Hurry up. Chapter 1057. P.S. If you want to hear more of your voices and receive more of your suggestions, search for the WeChat public account, Dread, and follow it to give more support to The Amber Sword. Brando and the Shire stopped. In front of them was a strange building, which seemed to be a large illegal building made up of many roofs stacked together. A tin chimney snaked up along the layers of roofs, and a lazy black cat lay on the red tiles, wagging its tail and half squinting in the sun. The old white wall was covered with ivy, and a wooden sign was placed outside the door of the shop with a line of words written in italic cruse, "Indulgent Rose." Seeing this line of text, Brando knew that he had found the right place. This was 5201 Suman Street. On the surface, it was an alchemy shop with a 30-year history, but in fact, there was a secret underground. Brando knew that this was one of the secret contact points of the Hazel people in the city. This is it. Brando nodded. The Shire looked up and down at the place and couldn't help but say, "It doesn't look any different, but those Hazel people are so well hidden. Do you really think they need to intervene?" "It's not a question of whether it's necessary or not." Brando swept the dust on his chest with his hand and replied matter-of-factly, "It's just a matter of convenience for them, but they can get a lot of benefits, and even if they fail, there's no loss to them, so why wouldn't they agree? But there's no such thing as an airtight wall in this world, my lord. They should know very well that the Cruz people will find out who helped us behind the scenes." "So what?" Brando asked back. "It seems that you don't know the Hazel people, the Shire. Does my lord know them very well?" "Naturally. In fact, the relationship between the Empire and Hazel was very special. Before that, Hazel used to be a loose city-state. The short Hazel people were naturally good at magic, but unlike the Bugas, they were more interested in research and development of all kinds of storage devices. They believed in the dragon crystal of wisdom, and thought that the spark of thinking and wisdom was the power to inspire everything. In that era, the Empire's strategy towards Hazel was to secretly support some city-states, create conflicts between city-states, and maintain balance, so that Hazel would never be able to form a political and military entity that could threaten the Empire. This balance had been maintained for hundreds of years. But about 130 years ago, a prophet was born among the Hazel people. This sage put forward a famous hypothesis, the theory that the individual is the whole. In this theory, the Hazel people believed that the wisdom of an individual was limited, but the collision of ideas could make wisdom sublimate, thus giving birth to a godlike brilliance. Therefore, the Hazel people believed that in a whole, the wisdom of each individual was crucial. The whole was composed of individuals, so individuals would also be an indispensable part of the overall wisdom. Under the guidance of this theory, the Hazel people carried out a thorough revolution, the revolution of the popularization of magical technology. At the same time, a republic composed of city-states was established like lightning. By the time the Cruz people reacted, they found that a powerful opponent had appeared beside them. The hatred of the past hundreds of years made it almost impossible to have peace between the two countries. On the one hand, the Empire had great power, but the Hazel people's legions armed with magical technology were not at a disadvantage against the Empire. So the war broke out. Although the Empire was powerful, only 1 out of 10 people could be trained to become a qualified knight. On the other hand, although the Republic's individual strength was weak, their ordinary soldiers only needed to be trained slightly and equipped with magic devices to possess power close to that of a knight. The Empire had the Mage Corps. Although the Hazel people's magic shooters were not good at fighting, they had artillery and tanks. The Empire had the Pegasus Knight and the Griffin Knight. The Hazel people also had airplanes and airships. Even if there was a slight difference in combat strength, they could make up for it with numbers. It would take the Empire about 5 years to train a qualified Pegasus Knight, but it would only take the Hazer people 6 months to build an airship. Even if it was 3 or 4 airships in exchange for a Knight of the Empire, it was still a good deal. In fact, after decades of popularization and progress of magical technology, the Hazel people gradually recovered from the situation of losing on the battlefield and even launched a counterattack. If it were not for the outbreak of the demonic wave, the Cruz people were likely to face an embarrassing defeat on the Western Front. In fact, the most recent war between the Cruz people and the Hazel people was 7 years ago. At that time, the White Legion invaded Banlin Valley and occupied Banlin for 3 years, but not long after that, they were driven back by the Hazel people. The Empire did not publicize the defeat of Banlin because of this reason, but in fact, the Hazel people have the advantage on the border at the moment. The war is not over yet. It's just that both sides are exhausted and unable to fight anymore. They can only stand on the confrontation front, which is also the border. Under such circumstances, Brando replied, "Do you think the Hazel people will be afraid of the Cruz people's anger? They can't wait to extend the front to other places. Have they not considered a truce?" The Shire was a little incredulous. Especially since the Empire does not only have the Republic of Hazel as an enemy. Hundreds of years of hatred, how can it be so easy to disappear? Brando shook his head. Maybe one day in the future, the Hazel people and the Cruz people will restore the normal relationship between countries, but that will also be after all the blood has been shed. This is a hatred of generations, it must be appeased with blood. That's terrible. The Shire could not help but sigh. The two of them had only stood outside the house for a moment, but they had already attracted the attention of the people inside the house. A rather respectable young noble from a foreign country, accompanied by his wizard followers, was carrying a sword. The black leather of the scabbard and the silver ornaments on the scabbard were obviously very valuable. One look and one could tell that this was a generous guest. In many big cities, magic shops did not only cater to wizards. Ordinary people were their main customers. Deodorants, insect repellents, and some convenient alchemy products, including all kinds of incense, were all daily necessities. However, the real big customers were the adepts. "Sir, outside the door, don't you want to come in and have a look?" The boss with a big belly shouted from behind the counter. "You don't have the things I want here." Brando smiled back. The boss was unhappy. "Hey, young man, don't talk big. I promise you with the credibility of the 30 years of Addicted to Roses that you can't find a more complete range of goods than here in the Empire. This place has a good reputation, you can go and ask." "That's more like it," Brendel thought. "Is that so? Then I want the glory of Zell, the unyielding sword, the light of thinking, and the glory of wisdom." The boss's face changed. "I don't understand what you are talking about, young man." "It doesn't matter if you don't understand. Ask Mutt to come out and see me. I want to talk about big business." The boss looked at the two of them with a complicated expression. Although they were far away, he could still see Charles's snow-white teeth as he smiled at him. His face darkened, and his shoulders sank slightly. But Brando opened his mouth. "I know you have a Type 4 flintlock under the counter, but that thing is useless to me. In a quarter of an hour, the patrolling cavalry will pass by here. You won't do anything stupid, right?" The boss froze. After a while, he spoke again. "Who are you?" His voice was a little hoarse. "Foreigners." The county answered with a smile. Brando shook his head. "Who we are is not important to you. What's important is that we have no evil intentions." "I can't guarantee that." The boss frowned. Although the Empire is big, Brando glanced at him. "But I can still find Roby Castle." Roby Castle was the headquarters of the patrolling cavalry. Hearing Brando's words, the boss believed him. He put down the gun and carefully looked at the two of them. Then he said, "You guessed wrong about one thing. Mr. Erwin, the gun in my hand is a Type 3 rifle." Brando remembered that in this era, Hazel's Type 4 rifle had just been developed and was not officially installed. And the foreign spy departments naturally changed their weapons even later. Regarding this small mistake, he did not take it to heart and smiled. The boss looked around vigilantly and then waved to them. "Come in and talk, the two of you." Brando and the County walked into the shop. The light in the room was slightly dim. The first thing they saw was a variety of cabinets and shelves on the wall. There was a dazzling array of strange items on the shelves. Most of them were all kinds of potions. There were a few daggers and a light crossbow on the counter. There was also a box covered with velvet. The groove in the middle seemed to be used to store these weapons. He turned his head again. On one side was a huge glass window. From the inside of the shop, he could clearly see the situation on the street outside. It seemed that these Hazel people were still very vigilant. The layout of the shop was very conducive to observing the movements outside. It was easy to defend and difficult to attack. The specially arranged messy room was easy to hide weapons. As long as there was an invasion, the people in the shop could defend at any time. The key was that even after such a layout, Indulgent Rose was still the most traditional magic shop. At least from the outside, there was no flaw. Hazel and Cruz had been fighting for hundreds of years. Who knew how many spies there were in their respective territories? They were already very experienced in this aspect. "Two sirs, please wait for a moment. I have to ask Mr. Mudd's opinion." "As you wish." The boss knocked a few times on a piece of metal embedded on the counter. It was sometimes long and sometimes short. There was no pattern to it. But after a moment, he looked up and said to Brando, "Mr. Mudd agreed, but there is one condition. You can go in, but your follower has to stay." "Then I'll stay." The County shrugged and replied indifferently. The boss was slightly stunned. He thought that the other party would hesitate. He did not expect the other party to be so straightforward. And why did the wizard follower not seem to care about the safety of his master? Whether or not there was danger, as a follower, how could he just let his protector leave his side? Of course, he did not know that the County, as a planeswalker card, could be summoned to Brando's side at any time. So, there was no difference whether he left or not. Brando smiled at him. "Since I dared to come here alone, I naturally have full confidence." "In that case," the boss's expression changed again, "then come with me." He opened the door and let Brando in. The two went up the stairs to the second floor. In a room on the second floor facing the street, Brando met the person in charge of this place. It was a Hazel man who was half the height of an ordinary human. He wore a decent black suit with a white vest inside. Silver chains hung on his trousers, a pocket watch in his pocket, a cane in his hand, and a hat on his head. His hair was meticulously combed. He did not look like a spymaster. Instead, he looked like a gentleman. This short Hazel man had a mustache and wore a monocle. When Brando looked at him, he squinted his eyes and looked at Brando through the monocle. "An Erewhon man," he said. "Why is an Erewhon man here at this moment?" Brando looked at the short man. He only knew that the other party was called Mutt. As for his experience as the person in charge here at this moment, he only learned about it from his personal resume. This meant that this guy was later promoted because only NPCs who had reached a certain level of status would be given detailed resumes by players to facilitate quests and gain reputation. Judging from the bureaucratic system of Hazel, this guy was likely to be promoted to an ambassador or the deputy director of the security department after meritorious service. "I'm here to ask you for a favor." Brando went straight to the point. Mutt smiled. "I think I know who you are." Brando did not mind. It would be strange if Mutt could not guess who he was. As a spy network, if they did not know what happened in the Empire recently, they might as well go home and plant sweet potatoes. "You are Count Tonagel." Oh, I heard that you will soon be Count Ranner. You know, I'm very happy to see you here at this moment, because your appearance here means that the Empire is in trouble. Mutt shrugged. You know, I'm happy whenever the Empire is in trouble. Praise the light of wisdom and thinking. So, Count Ranner, what can we do to help you? Also, he waved his cane, what benefits can we get? What I need your help with isn't troublesome at all. Brendel replied. It's not troublesome, Mutt nodded, this is one of the reasons. I know you have more to say, so please continue. I want you to help me investigate the whereabouts of a person. This should be easy for you. Then, who is it? It's her, Brando corrected, Countess Wallach. You should have heard of her before, right? So it's her, Mutt's monocle reflected the light, I understand now. Wonderful, it seems like you want to make the Empire lose face. It's not just a matter of face, Brando said, it's also about the Highlanders. Mutt took a deep breath, I have to say, you're right. It seems like this is a good deal. He paused for a moment, in other words, we only need to help you investigate the whereabouts of Countess Wallach. That's all. I'll do the rest. Then, what benefits will you get? As far as I know, the Empire is the Republic's enemy, but not necessarily Erwin's. The greatest benefit is to be able to save my subordinates. Mutt couldn't help but take a deep look at him, the Republic never gives up on any of its subjects. Wisdom and glory are one, and the individual is all. He reached out his hand. It seems that Hazel and Erwin may not necessarily have to fight side by side on the battlefield, but they can still be good allies. Brendel smiled and shook his hand. It's a pleasure working with you. P.S. I recommend a book, Ghost Hunter in the City. It's quite interesting after reading the first few chapters. Book number is 3443177. The novel, The Amber Sword, will have more fresh content on the official WeChat platform, and there's a 100% chance of a lucky draw for everyone. Open WeChat now, click the plus sign on the top right to add friend, search for the public account, Dread, and follow it. Hurry up. Chapter 1058. Then I'll go back now, Mr. Kent. Go ahead. Be careful on the road. It's not safe out there. Old Kent shook his head and watched Seti's figure disappear into the dusk outside the inn. He then closed the door and prepared to close the shop. He was already old, and his hands and feet had become less and less nimble over the years. He slowly turned around, only to find that there was another person standing behind him. He couldn't help but shiver in fright. Then, he found that the other person was the woman in the group of guests. He didn't know her name, but she stayed here with her companions 3 days ago. Her beauty naturally left a deep impression on people, not to mention that there were some regrettable faint scars on her almost perfect face, which left a deep impression on people. Old Kent did not know if it was his imagination, but he felt that the scars on the woman's face had faded a little after a day of not seeing her. He thought to himself, how is that possible? Maybe I'm seeing things. Miss, how can I help you? Old Kent humbly replied. Over the past few days, he could vaguely sense a hint of bossiness in her tone and habits. He had seen it many times in the noble ladies and lords in the city, but he did not want to think too much about why a noble lady would come to stay in his inn in such a remote place. Is everyone hungry? Would you like some supper or something? There are still some ingredients in the kitchen. Is her name Seti? That girl. Delphian smirked. She looked through the maple window on the other side. A few sycamore leaves hung down from the window. They were dyed red by the sunset and swayed slightly in the wind. She stared at the direction where Seti's figure disappeared into the dusk, her purple eyes quietly reflecting the sunset. Yes, she's a poor girl. I heard that her brother went to the battlefield and old Chris was in poor health. She had to take care of her siblings and the chores at home. Old Kent could not help but sigh and shake his head. Old Chris had a good daughter, but she was too unlucky. Lady Luck never shows mercy to the unluckiest. Doesn't she stay here? No, she has to go back every day. I gave her special permission. Her brother went to the battlefield. Is he in the east? I'm not too sure about that, Mississippi. It's probably in the south. In the south. Delphian narrowed her eyes slightly. Who was the person who picked her up? The person who picked her up. Old Kent was stunned. Maybe. Delphian smiled and said, maybe I was wrong. What? It's nothing. I'm just saying that you don't have to bother with supper. If you really need it, I'll ask Miss Seti for help when she's here. Martha above, thank you for your kindness. Old Kent couldn't help but look at the lady gratefully. Such a kind and beautiful noble lady was rare in Rushta. I hope Jean Yen can stay by her side and take care of this kind lady. He couldn't help but think. And Delphine just smiled quietly at this. Outside the inn, a young man in a short-sleeved shirt grabbed Seti's hand and dragged her towards the St. Mercury Bridge until they were out of cat and beard sight. What's wrong, Al? Seti asked in confusion. Someone's watching you, the young man replied in a low voice. Watching? Me? How? Seti couldn't help but look back at the inn. It was now just a small spot on the road. Uncle Ken would never do that. Then it's someone else. You mean those guests? Maybe. Anyway, be careful, Seti. The young man turned around and looked at her with a serious expression. Seti couldn't help but cover her mouth and smile. You worry too much, Al. I don't belong to the same world as them. But thank you anyway. She blushed and couldn't help but tighten her grip on the young man's hand. She could feel the warmth from his hand spreading to her heart. What do you want from me, Al? Don't forget about the prayer meeting tonight. Of course not. What's so important about it? Why did you suddenly mention it? The deacon said that tonight is the most important day. Seti paused for a second, then a bright light flashed in his eyes. He held his breath and asked, Is it going to start? The young man nodded with a gloomy face. After today, I'll make that old witch pay. Sooner or later, I'll avenge Pebber with my own hands. Thank you, Al, Seti replied softly, but she still felt a little uneasy. But can we really do it? Of course. Have you forgotten what that old witch did? I heard that this damned country lost a war recently. Losing a war means that they need more soldiers. Seti, Uncle Chris can't go to the battlefield anymore. The young man didn't know much about the war, but that didn't stop him from using the deacon's words. Even though he didn't like those deacons, he had to admit that what they said made sense. Those deacons couldn't see so far ahead and had always suffered in silence. Seti's words lit a fire in his heart. He pursed his lips, and the fire of revenge burned in his eyes. Seti fell silent when she thought of her old father. She still had 2 younger brothers and a younger sister. No matter what, she had to stand up and protect her family. By the way, Deacon Merriam specifically mentioned you. The young man suddenly remembered something and changed his tone. He asked me to tell you that you must attend the meeting tonight. Seti was a little surprised. She didn't understand why she suddenly became so important. But when she thought of the strict rules of the church, she knew that she could only obey. I understand. The 2 of them fell into silence. They walked quietly on the path of the sacred Mercury Bridge and watched the sunset leave a golden glow on the river. After a while, the young man spoke again. Seti. His voice was soft and full of emotion. Yes. I have a feeling that those people are not good people. Let's leave after this is over. but I still have brothers and sisters. My father, let me take care of them, the young man interrupted her. Let's take them, take everyone, and leave this place as far as we can. The last ray of light was swallowed by the river, leaving only the clouds in the sky. Seti's heart was filled with sweetness. She held the young man's hand and nodded gently. The innkeeper respectfully bid farewell to Delphian and hobbled away. The Prime Minister's daughter stood by the window and glanced at the magnificent twilight on the main road. She smiled enigmatically and then turned to go upstairs. In the room on the second floor, Brando was analyzing the information he received from Antiburo's envoy group, the Nazar people, and the nobles in the city that Vahina and Delphian contacted. Finally, he had a rough idea of what was happening in the city. Medisha sat on a high-backed chair with a serious expression. She carefully recorded the information on a piece of parchment with a quill pen. Vahina softly dictated from her side. After she finished writing a piece of parchment, she picked it up and put it aside. Brando then stacked the parchment on the table. The last ray of sunlight was leaving the table reluctantly, and the sky outside the window was already hazy. He turned around and saw the side of the silver elf princess face. The last rays of sunlight fell between her forehead and chin, and under the crisscrossing light, the outline of the girl's face was covered with a layer of thin, almost imperceptible fluff, which made her look especially cute. My lord, it seems that the Silver Queen is not strict with the nobles imprisoned in the Tessberg. At least, from this letter, we can see that, my lord. Medisha turned around and saw what he was looking at. She could not help but blush. My lord, Vahina stopped her narration and looked over. She could not help but frown. Faced with their gazes, Brando finally came back to his senses. He coughed awkwardly and said that. I'm sorry, I got there. The letter. Brando then remembered the letter that Medisha mentioned. The owner of the letter was no stranger to him. It was the former commander of the Azure Army, Vahina's mentor, Lady Veronica. He had met her twice in the loop of trade winds and Abes. The letter was sent by someone after she learned that Vahina had used her connections in the city to investigate her and the Duke of Flower Leaf. Since Veronica did not know that he was near the imperial capital, the letter only described her and the Duke of Flower Leaf's recent situation in the Tessberg. They were treated fairly well in the Tessberg. Other than having their freedom restricted, they were not punished as harshly as the rumors said. However, from between the lines, one could see that the commander was anxious. In the letter, she mentioned several times that she was worried and uneasy about the Silver Queen's recent actions. It was obvious that she was not bent on opposing the Silver Queen. She and the other nobles in Ludwig were siding with the eldest son of the emperor because she was not optimistic about the Silver Queen's choice. She did not want the Silver Queen's crazy actions to lead the empire into an abyss of no return. Compared to the naked conflict of interests between the northern nobles, the emotions contained in the letter were more acceptable to Brando. It was not something that an egoist could understand. It was a long-term vision, a hope that the country could be stable, and those who lived at the bottom of the society could also enjoy the benefits brought by prosperity. It was a noble feeling, not blind, but just looking at the future. Although they belonged to different countries, Brando could empathize with this wish. The difference was that he had personally experienced this period of history, but Lady Veronica could see the future with her own eyes. It was a pity that the empire was now in the abyss of war, and the commander was in a difficult situation. She could not even protect herself. He thought for a moment and replied, "This means that the Silver Queen has not made up her mind. Some of these nobles can be roped in, but she just can't find the time to do it. If we lost at Fat Tan Harbor," Medisha could not help but mention. "Then it's already decided who's going to die and who's going to live. Fortunately, we won. Her Majesty has to find another opportunity to display her power and intimidate the people." Brendel continued. Vahina was a little absent-minded. She should have been worried. Although the news from the Moss Castle was the best news she had heard in a while, it did not mean that she could sit back and relax. Her Majesty did not make a move because she was not completely confident. When the situation in Ludwig was settled, the Mihodafen family would be like meat on the chopping board, waiting to be slaughtered. She would never imagine that her family was part of the nobles that the temperamental queen could rope in. Even if the Duke of Flower and Leaf did not have the intention to rebel, they were inextricably linked to the northern nobles. Brando's words undoubtedly proved this point. But at this moment, the young lady of Flower and Leaf was a little absent-minded. She looked at Brando, and then at Medisha. Her face was a little worried. Brando did not notice the young lady's abnormality and continued to ask, "Did the Zayres contact you?" Medisha shook her head and put a piece of parchment in front of Brando. "This is a message from Princess Magadol. It mentioned a place." "Where is it?" "It's not a confirmed location, but it mentioned that the Silver Queen and Constance had been there twice in the past week. It's the Tulip District." The Eastern Front had just been defeated, and at this time of the year, the Silver Queen obviously would not be in the mood to participate in garden activities or visit insignificant characters. If she still took the time to go there at this time, it must not be that simple. Although it could be a smokescreen, Brando could not help but take it seriously. Just as he was about to look at the map, Faina finally could not help but speak. "I know that place, Brando. That's the old prince's mansion, the former residence of the late king's younger brother, Prince Cyrus." Hearing the name, Brando finally remembered the place. "Is it the prince who died in the Holy War?" "And his two sons," Vahaina added. She stared at Brando and bit her lower lip. Medisha looked at the young lady of Flower and Leaf strangely, and then looked at her lord. Her silver eyes suddenly flashed with a hint of understanding, and the corner of her small mouth lifted slightly. She could not help but feel a little amused. But she did not show it on her face, and continued to speak seriously. "There's a place near this old mansion that is heavily guarded. Even if Antoinette's envoy passes by that place every day, they will be strictly interrogated." "What is that place?" Brando frowned. "Why is it getting more and more complicated? Could it be that Her Majesty set up forbidden areas everywhere in the imperial capital?" Cold Dew Manor. Chapter 1059. Frostdew Manor. Brendel tapped the table with his fingertips and replied thoughtfully, "Delphine hasn't found out where Vala and the conservative faction of the Holy Cathedral of Fire are being held. If the Silver Queen isn't deliberately deceiving us, assuming that one of the prince's old residence and the Cold Dew Manor is where the prison is, then the other, in fact, ever since the Silver Queen split the Holy Cathedral, the faction represented by Vala was known as the conservative faction, while the other faction was naturally the reformist faction represented by the scholarly faction. Scarlet is there." Medisha's silver eyes lit up as she understood what he was trying to say. "My lord, should we make a move?" she immediately asked. Brando shook his head. "It's best to investigate first," he replied. Although the place seemed very likely, he could not rule out the possibility that the Silver Queen had deliberately set up a trap or a diversion. The best way was to sneak in and investigate first. "Tonight, Brando, let me go." Before he could finish, he was interrupted by Vahaina, who stood beside him. She blurted out almost without thinking, and then seemed to realize what she had said. She saw Brando and Medisha looking at her in shock, and her face turned red as if it was burning. I'm very familiar with that place." "But Vahaina, you don't seem to know how to sneak in, right?" Brando could not help but ask. "My master has taught me how to sneak in and perform secret operations, but..." Vahaina replied in a small voice. "You just don't have actual combat experience, right?" Vahaina's face turned red, but she insisted, "Even if I don't have actual combat experience, I can still do it well. This is not an outing, my lady." I know. Vahina blinked lightly, and her voice became weak. I can stay at the periphery. I know there are a few unknown paths there. That won't do. Brando shook his head. It's not safe. According to our plan, non-combatants should avoid participating as much as possible. Vahina had no choice but to shut her mouth, and only glared at Brando with her blue eyes. Just when Brando thought that she was going to throw a tantrum again, she bit her lower lip and replied softly, I understand. The contrast surprised Brando. In his mind, this lady was still the unruly little princess of the loop of trade winds. He was prepared for her to throw a tantrum, but he did not expect her to only say, I understand, in the end. It felt like he punched a ball. He couldn't help but look at her cautiously. He saw this kind of attitude from one person the most, Miss Merchant. Usually, when the Roman girl had to bow her head, she would say something nice, but in reality, she would do the exact opposite. She would not change no matter how hard he tried, which gave him a headache. Fortunately, he knew that Vahina would not be so shameless. She had her own pride, and would not play such petty tricks. Medisha, who was watching the conversation between the two, smiled mysteriously at Vahina, and suggested to Brando, My lord, in my opinion, it might be better to bring Miss Vahina along. Brando was startled. He did not expect Medisha to suddenly change sides. Medisha. He turned to look at her, as if to make sure that she was not joking. Vahina also raised her head and looked at Medisha, who was sitting on the chair, in shock. Because Miss Sydney is not suitable to enter the city. Her target is too obvious, Medisha replied with a smile. She could be said to be the one who had followed Brando the longest outside of the Shire. She could see through her lord's thoughts at a glance, and thus could speak with assurance. If this is a trap set by the Silver Queen, then her target might be Miss Sydney, and not Miss Vahina. She has plenty of opportunities in the past few days, so why bother? Brando suddenly understood. This was reverse thinking. If the Silver Queen used Vala as bait, then her target would probably be the Lion Palace's saintess, as Medisha said. She also had an urgent motive. Obtaining the sacred sword Odorfice was the most important step for her to integrate and control the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In his camp, other than himself, the successor of Odin, Sydney was probably the most important person to the Silver Queen. Relatively speaking, the ownership of the flower domain was not that important to her. If Sydney could not enter the Imperial City, he would need to choose between Delphian and Vahina, who were familiar with the Imperial City, as a replacement. In comparison, Vahina was slightly more suitable. Although the two of them did not have the ability to protect themselves, at least she was Veronica's student and had excellent swordsmanship. Vahina, on the other hand, was no different from an ordinary person after consuming the Spring of Spring that had side effects. In fact, in this era where the magic tide was beginning to affect the entire world, Vahina, who had no power, was worse than an ordinary person. With this in mind, Brando could not help but look at Vahina. Are you sure? You'll have to ask Miss Vahina if she's ready, Medisha replied seriously. This is a dangerous job. I'm fine. I'll take care of myself. Don't forget whose student I am, Vahina hurriedly answered. Brando looked at Vahina and actually wanted to complain about her teacher. He was currently imprisoned in the Tundra Castle, but considering his respect for the Legion commander, he could not bear to tarnish her reputation. Hence, he held back his words. He sighed. Although this might not be the best choice, at least it wasn't the worst. He thought that this was the only way. At this moment, someone knocked on the door. Brando subconsciously looked at the sky and guessed who it might be. Vahina turned to open the door and saw Sydney standing outside with a serious face. Because Brando had promised to help this lady repair the holy sword Odorfice, she would appear at this time almost every day. She would not appear a minute earlier or later, and as time passed, the others had gotten used to it. But today, in addition to the lady with the statue of the Lion Palace, Delphine, who had just come upstairs, was also standing outside the door. The Prime Minister's daughter had a faint smile on her face, but the unapproachable look in her eyes made Vahina uncomfortable and she subconsciously took a step back. "Miss Sydney, Delphine, you're here." Brando greeted. Delphine smiled, indicating that she was just passing by. Brando turned his head and looked at the expressionless Sydney. "Miss Sydney. Sorry to disturb you, Count Brendel." The lioness' voice was as calm as water. "Can you spare some time?" Brando nodded. He had promised her when they were at Fathom Harbor that once the battle at Fathom Harbor was over, he would help her repair the holy sword Oderfice. Now that they had won the battle at Fathom Harbor, he naturally would not find any excuse to go back on his word. Besides, he was also very interested in the legendary flaming blade. Medisha quickly got up and gave Vahina a look. She then led the young lady of flower leaf collar out. Although Delphine was still standing outside the door, she did not intend to enter. It was as she said, she was just passing by on her way upstairs. After Miss Sydney entered the room, Medisha closed the door and looked up at Delphine. The Prime Minister's daughter was slightly startled and asked, "Do you have something to say to me, Miss Medisha? I thought that you would betray us as soon as you returned to the imperial capital." Medisha said softly. "But I didn't," Delphine smiled. "We worked well together at Fathom Harbor. Miss Medisha, why don't you choose to continue believing in me?" "Because I can't feel sincerity from you," Medisha replied. "The elves can distinguish the hearts of those with ulterior motives." This is actually referring to the Silver Elves. "I can't guess what you're thinking, Miss Delphine, but I know you're up to no good." "Are you really a Silver Elf, Miss Medisha?" But Medisha did not pay any attention to her. Delphine sighed. "That's why I don't understand what you're trying to say, Miss Medisha. You should understand that what I'm doing now is not disadvantageous to you at all. My lord thinks that the conflict between you and him is just a misunderstanding. He admires you very much, just like Miss Mithril. But that doesn't mean that I will be soft-hearted." Medisha's face turned cold. She rarely showed this side of her in front of outsiders. "I just want to repeat what I said last time, don't give me the chance to pierce your heart with my spear." She stared coldly into Delphine's eyes and said word by word, "Toslagim. Eternal enmity, by any means necessary. I swear by the ancient proverb of the Silver Elves." You should have heard of this proverb. Eternal enmity. Delphine's purple eyes flashed. Outside the window, it was already late at night. The room was lit by candles. Sydney chanted an incantation, then stretched out her right hand, as if she was holding a sword hilt in the void. She slowly pulled to the right, and pulled out a sword covered with cracks and scars from the void. The body of the sword had long been broken, and the shards that were flickering with a metallic luster were suspended in the air. It still maintained the shape of a sword, and the edge of the blade occasionally flashed with a dark red light. This was the holy sword Oderfice. Brando had seen this scene many times, but he was still shocked every time. This was the shape of the holy sword. It had died with the departure of the Flame King, so the craftsman could not reforge its body. The shards of the flaming blade that Sydney brought out from the Holy Cathedral were actually more memorable to the believers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. After all, it was made by Gretel, the Flame King, but it was essentially no different from an ordinary shard of a sword. He had only recently learned this secret, which made him wonder if the Halran Gaia in his hand was the same. Although Halran Gaia was more complete, Sydney told him that if the Flaming Blade's physical body was still intact in the material world, its power would not be inferior to the Halran Gaia. With the passage of time, the faith of a legend seeped into the sword, turning it from an ordinary item into a powerful ancient sacred sword. One had to know that Yak's Lionheart's sword was once his most ordinary sword. The hearts of the people gathered to form faith, and the legend was cast. The powerful hidden desire and the magic in the words engraved the objects of this world in the world of laws. Therefore, the ancient sword could exist. Sydney let go of her hand and motioned for him to come forward. Brando was already familiar with the process. He reached out and took the hilt of the holy sword from the lady's hand, and a familiar feeling came from the sword. In fact, back in Fathom Harbor, he had used the recognition of Odorfei's soul to inject it into the fragment of the holy sword. At that time, he had established a faint connection with the law of the flaming blade. However, it was not that simple to repair Odorfeis. The soul of the holy sword fell into a deep sleep because its projection in the world of laws was fragmented, and the reason why its projection in the world of laws was fragmented was because of the lack of faith, which meant that it had lost its support in the world. Now, although this ancient soul had awakened and recognized him, its form in the world still had no support. The formation of a faith, the birth of a legend, was not something that could be supported by a single person. Even if Brando had the soul of Odorfeis, he could not give the flaming blade a new life. What he needed to do was to restore its glory. He held the hilt of the flaming blade, and the ancient soul in his body immediately resonated with its remnant form in the world, forming layers of illusions in front of him. What was it that created its own legend, that caused its name to travel across the land, that caused everyone to praise it, and that caused this holy sword to exist in this world? Then, where was the pride of the sword? It was once the holy sword of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and the Flame King used it to start a new era. The pure flame separated the dark thorns and burned a path out of despair. However, what Brando saw in the illusions was not the Flame King's most glorious moment. On the White Plains, he announced the end of an unprecedented empire. From that moment on, all injustice and oppression were announced. The flaming blade Odorfeis was in his hands, and under the sunlight that pierced through the dark clouds, it shone brightly. What he saw was everything burning amidst the raging flames. The palaces and cities, this scene seemed familiar. Pairs of unyielding eyes, burning with anger, what was burning in the flames and turning into ashes? What was laughable arrogance? What was the unyielding flame that gave birth to the resistance under oppression? Its existence announced that everyone could firmly grasp their own fate. This was the golden flames, symbolizing resistance and an oath that would never compromise. Therefore, I will give it, and not the empire, to the world. This was the path of the golden flame. Chapter 1060. The Roman rested her chin on her hand and looked at the hazy night sky outside the window in boredom. The way she rested her chin on her hand made the merchant girl look a little chubby, giving her a lazy and cute feeling. She was different from the other Erewhon people. Her dark brown pupils reflected the brilliance of the stars, weaving a story with the dreams of a young girl. It's so boring, Hippamra. Do you like crabs that much? The cleric girl standing at the side blushed and replied, but Miss Roman, don't their carapaces look very cute? They are firm and thick, just in line with the teachings of the goddess. Now that you mention it, they do seem a little cute. The merchant girl's eyes lit up as if she had found something fun. She subconsciously turned back to look at the crabs that Hippamra kept in her precious fish tank. Since the last batch of pets were killed by the little fat dragon Sheeta, Hippamra changed these crabs, because these things might not die so easily. But perhaps because she turned too quickly, the Roman actually leaned back and lost her balance. She screamed in fright and waved her hands, thinking that she would fall immediately, but she suddenly felt someone supporting her from behind, allowing her to regain her balance. The Roman was startled and looked back with lingering fear to see who was supporting her from behind, but found that there was no one in the room except for her and Hippamra. The door was open, and outside was a dark corridor. Hippamra, did you just support me? Miss Roman, are you okay? Hippamra seemed to have just reacted. Seems like it wasn't. The Roman looked around suspiciously. Brando. White mist. She called out twice, but no one answered. Her little eyebrows furrowed slightly, as if she didn't quite understand what had happened. She thought carefully and finally ran to close the door. Brando looked at the broken holy sword Odorfice in his hand and seemed to have understood something. History would never repeat itself. Empires would decay, but this time, their people had flames and sharp swords. Prometheus brought fire to the human world, and from that moment onwards, humanity possessed light. Resistance. Is this the belief you carry? Brando sighed softly and tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword. Then, let me inherit your will. However, all of a sudden, a sense of resistance came from the sword. Brando was caught off guard and almost dropped his sword to the ground. What happened? The sword is resisting me, why? The illusions in front of him suddenly changed. Like a slideshow, Brando saw many people and many scenes in an instant. Finally, a figure stopped in front of him. It was in the royal hall of St. Cantilever Palace. The Silver Queen, Constance, stood on the throne with a cold smile and looked down at her. This is arrogance. Then all the illusions disappeared, and the scene in front of him returned to the narrow room of Cat and Beard. The dim light of the candle flickered, and a spark occasionally burst out from the wick. Sydney looked at him with concern. What's wrong? I failed again. Brando frowned and shook his head. He felt that he had clearly understood the belief of Holy Sword Odorfice, but why did it still reject him in the end? This made him a little discouraged. It's okay, this is not an easy thing to begin with. The Saintess of Leo Palace was more open-minded than him and comforted him with a calm expression. I can see that you are making much better progress today, don't worry too much. That was true. Brando was not someone who was easily discouraged. He had experienced much more painful failures than this. In that failure, he and they had lost almost everything. He quickly adjusted his state of mind and replied, let me check again, I seem to feel some progress. He still felt a little incredulous about the previous scene and was eager to find out what had happened. Sydney nodded quietly. Brando immediately calmed down and began to check the holy sword Odorfice in his hand. After checking, he was immediately shocked. Because the holy sword did not change, the one who changed was himself. The soul of Holy Sword Odorfice, which was the power of the flame orb, had been hidden in his body all this time. He had not been able to feel the existence of the other party, but at this moment, he could clearly feel that it existed in his body. The flame orb seemed to have transferred part of its power into his body. The most direct result was that his two fire elemental pools had expanded by more than a third. After a series of battles and the growth of his strength, his fire elemental pool was originally at 32 points and 81 points respectively. Now, it had increased to 44 points and 123 points respectively. And the expansion of the elemental pools was accompanied by a substantial increase in his own strength. His strength, which was originally at the peak of the elemental enlightenment, had faintly stepped into the peak of the law. At this moment, he was only a hair's breadth away from touching the top of the sky-reaching white tower. But what shocked him the most was that he found that he had gained the authority of a planeswalker. What's going on? What had happened before? Why did the previous scene have such a change? If he had completely gained the approval of the Holy Sword Odorfice, why did the sword reject him at the last moment? While he was puzzled, he suddenly heard Sydney's somewhat stern voice ask, "Who's there?" Brando immediately woke up and raised his head. He found that the Saintess of the Leo Palace was looking at a corner of the room with a serious expression, but there was nothing there. No, it wasn't completely empty. Brando immediately sensed the abnormality there. The corner of the room was disappearing, the floor and walls seemed to be swallowed by an invisible force. After collapsing and withering, only a void was left. And the void was expanding infinitely, quickly covering the entire room, spreading over the table, chair, and desk. Finally, the whole world fell into a boundless void world. This was the world of dreams. The 11th kingdom, the realm of formlessness. This was the world of nothingness, Castrinia's domain. A silhouette appeared out of thin air. She wore a dark purple witch robe, and her face was hidden under the shadow of the hood. As such, it was impossible to see her face clearly, and there was no way to determine her age. The only thing one could tell was that she was a young and mature woman by looking at the tip of her chin. Brando saw the other party's fated star at a glance. The star of confession, the main star of the bewitchment constellation. You're a witch of the Moon of Cups. You're Anway's successor. Sydney was about to attack, but after hearing Brando's words, she stopped. The Saintess of the Leo Palace coldly stared at the woman hiding her head and tail, as if the other party made the slightest move, she would mercilessly kill her. But the woman only humbly bowed to Brando. My lord, we witches only inherit the power of the 12 moons and constellations. This power never comes from a single person. My lord, you may be talking about my predecessor, but that is not important to me. The woman's voice was hoarse and mature, full of the charm of a mature woman, but it sounded familiar. Brando could not remember where he had heard such a voice. Logically speaking, a voice with such obvious characteristics should have left a deep impression on him. He shook his head, not knowing if this was one of the witch's magic. He only frowned and asked, "Are you clarifying your relationship?" He was not in a hurry to attack, because the witch took the initiative to show her fated star meant that she had no ill intentions. Of course, at least on the surface. Yes, the woman said bluntly, witches are only loyal to the true darkness dragon. My lord, the witch of the 11th moon, a follower of Castrinia, has come to serve you. However, there are 2 darkness dragons right now, Brando replied indifferently. As a witch who controls the domain of change and creation, it would be too ridiculous if I could not see through the changes of fate. No matter how the twin goddesses play with and manipulate the threads of fate, I can clearly see the clear answer behind the messy threads. That is you, my lord. Brando wanted to say, your predecessor, the Lady Anway mentioned earlier, although she is also a witch of the Moon of Cup who controls the domain of change and creation, her choice is completely opposite to yours. Moreover, even he himself could not be sure whether he was the darkness dragon or not. At least, he had never thought of himself that way. But he thought about it and did not say it out loud. What is your name? Tyr. This is my real name, named after the Moon of Cup. It was not a good habit for witches to take the initiative to reveal their real names, but they would never lie to the moon they belonged to. The other party seemed to be expressing some kind of goodwill, which meant that she did not have any malicious intentions. However, this did not mean anything because Brando knew that there were at least 3 witches who could change their borders. If the other party was not a follower of the Moon of Cup, then all of this was meaningless. Therefore, he did not dare to believe her easily. Probably seeing Brando's unhappy expression, the woman smiled and said, My lord, I do not expect to gain your trust from the beginning, but I have brought some important news. Why don't you listen to it? Brando thought for a moment and nodded. Of course, he would not easily believe information of unknown origin, but even if it was false, there must be some kind of intention behind it. The Buga wizards had a saying, lies do not lie. That was exactly what it meant. St. Cantifer Palace. The Silver Queen stood quietly in front of the French arched window, looking at the cold garden of white roses. The milk-like moonlight poured down on the quiet forest like a dream. Is that person still near Rushta? She suddenly spoke. Her voice was as cold as ice. Behind her, the Witch Queen and the Witch of the Lonely High Moon, Adatrice, emerged from the shadows. Beside them stood another tall figure. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize that it was the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn who had been missing for many days. But at the moment, she was not in good condition. Her face and body were covered with wounds. It was difficult for a dragon to be injured, but once injured, it was difficult to recover. A layer of black shadows covered the wounds. These shadows squirmed as if they were alive, occasionally causing her to frown in pain. The Silver Queen turned a blind eye to this strange scene and only looked at the two witches. "Yes, Your Majesty, they are still here. He and the girl are still here." The Witch Queen nodded slightly. "That's good." The Silver Queen also nodded. "The spy has passed the message. He must think that my target is Sydney, so he will definitely come in person." She tilted her head slightly. "I will give him a surprise. Are you ready?" The Witch Queen and Adatrice looked at each other and nodded. "What about the city? Is there anything unusual?" Witches could eavesdrop on people's inner secrets from their dreams. With this ability, the Silver Queen had already caught many of her potential opponents in Rushta, as well as those who intended to rebel. But this time, the Witch Queen frowned. "There are some abnormalities," she replied. "What?" Many people have disappeared from the dream world in the past few weeks, and the number of people who have disappeared is still increasing. "It's a trick of the cultists," the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn suddenly said, her face full of disdain. "Don't worry about those bugs. They can't do anything. Our biggest target now is that person. Don't waste too much energy on this." The Silver Queen glanced at Gwendolyn but did not say anything. The cultists were indeed not much of a problem. It was just a disease. But at this moment, the Witch Queen suddenly screamed in pain and opened her eyes. The silver color in her eyes quickly faded away, revealing a pair of beautiful and enchanting ice blue eyes. However, at this moment, her eyes were full of bewilderment, as if she had just woken up from a terrifying nightmare. But the nightmare did not end with her awakening. It was still going on. Who actually solidified the entire Rushta's dream world and completely sealed off Bunassan's borders? Who has such power? What's wrong? The Silver Queen frowned and stared at her. Obviously, she had never seen this side of the Witch Queen lose her composure. It made her feel a little uneasy. Someone forcibly cut off the connection between Bunassan and the real world, blocking everyone's dreams. Although it was only for a moment, but, get to the point. I have never felt such a powerful force. It's like when the former witches were still alive. Only they had the ability to move Bunassan into the real world. The Witch Queen panted and replied quickly. The Silver Queen frowned. Since the era of the War of the Holy Saints, it was an indisputable fact that the power of the mortal world had greatly declined. But this did not mean that she could ignore an existence that could ignore the rules of this era. Who is she? I don't know. Her power is very unfamiliar, and she only isolated the dream world for less than half an hour. I can't track her at all. But I suspect that she may be the previous Witch of the Moon of Cups, that crazy woman Euphkyria. Chapter 1061. The void receded like the tide. The night was dark. The windows were open, and the curtains danced like ghosts. The candles had been extinguished, and the moonlight poured into the room. Do you believe her? After a long silence, Sydney asked. Brando was silent. She didn't lie. But that was all. Not lying did not mean good intentions, and lying did not mean evil intentions. A fatal trap could be hidden behind the truth. Neither of them were rookies, and they both understood this in their hearts. So, what are you going to do? We have to change our plan. Brando replied, I'll call the Shire and Mephistopheles. Miss Sydney, please inform the ladies. The statue of the Lion Palace nodded. Outside the window, the huge shadow of the capital was entrenched. However, it was not the prosperous soil that thrived under the shadow. Since the beginning of the Civil War, the prosperity had long faded from this 1,000-year-old city, leaving only unspeakable wounds. The people living here did not understand why the Empire was fighting. Most of them had never even heard of the name Mardos. Although there were missionaries handing out leaflets on the streets every day, and they were forced to attend weekly worship services to preach Her Majesty's justice and so-called history. But that was all too far away. They did not understand why they were involved in this vortex for an illusory goal. Were the sages wrong? How could that be? The pride of the people of the Flame King was based on justice. How could they inherit the dark empire of the past? What right did they have? They did not understand why they had to kill each other for all this. This was a civil war of the empire, and the blood that flowed was the blood of the people of Cruz. People died every day. They were the husbands of wives, the children of parents, the fathers of children, and the relatives and friends of others. Even more people went missing on the battlefield. There was no news of them. Some people's relatives died at the hands of the Lion Men of Georgandy Ridge and Toquinin, but the Queen did not give them the corresponding honor. Instead, she called them traitors. For this reason, many people were secretly grateful to the Crown Prince, and the Count of Erewhon whom they had never met, because these two had avenged them. Later, these people were found out by the witches and hanged because they had betrayed the country. Life was becoming more and more difficult. Many people missed the days of the past. The capital of the empire had an inexhaustible supply of resources, and everyone lived a good life. They were proud to be citizens of the empire, and they didn't have to bear the pain of loss. But now, the glory was gone, and the supplies delivered to the imperial capital every day had to be prioritized for His Majesty's celebration. The circle of nobles was still talking about the upcoming engagement ceremony of the Countess, but in the lower levels of the empire, the enthusiasm was fading day by day. Until one day, all the voices fell silent. There was only a silent expression left in the darkness. The path is the goal. After 8:00, all kinds of figures began to appear on the dark and gloomy streets. They were dressed in different colors. Some were poor people, some were tailors, some were candlesticks, cobblers, or butchers. There were even low-level officials and soldiers. But the only thing they had in common was their silence. They were like a group of ghosts. When the two city guards on duty saw this scene, they felt as if they had seen a legendary ghost and shuddered. "There are more people today," one of the soldiers whispered uneasily. "Where are the patrolling cavalry? Why didn't anyone come to check?" "Don't joke around. Do they dare to check? Those soft-footed shrimps only dare to bully their own people." "But, Captain, lower your voice. Have you forgotten the guard at the gate?" The soldier who spoke felt a chill down his spine and subconsciously shut his mouth. Of course, he remembered that person. He was still a young man who didn't fit in with the crowd. The other party just dispersed these people's gathering. A week ago, his body was found in the woods outside the city. Because the murderer couldn't be traced, the case was left unsettled. He also heard that the number of missing guards had increased recently. Although the news was only privately circulated, the occasional word leaked still made a low-level city guard like him feel uneasy. Besides, the captain spoke again, his tone resentful. "What's the benefit of us caring so much? My brother died in Anzaruta. What happened to him? His Majesty calls them traitors. I don't believe that he would betray us. Now, that damned palace manager wants to use this as an excuse to investigate me. Do you think I don't know that he just wants to arrange a position for his nephew?" He spat angrily. The soldier was silent. He wanted to refute, but he didn't know what to say. Was the captain wrong? What happened in front of him was the truth. He even thought that maybe it was better to lose this job. The atmosphere in the city was getting stranger by the day. Maybe one day he would lose his head because of this. But if he lost this job, what should he do? Life was getting harder and harder. People in the slums were starving to death. If he lost his job, what should he use to feed his family? This was like a dead knot that couldn't be untied. It was suffocating. Why was it like this? What happened to the empire? The empire is sick. A man in a long robe walked past the two of them. He looked back at them. His snake-like pupils made them shudder. The other party seemed to be very satisfied with the resentment in the soldier's eyes. After saying this, he walked away. Crazy. The captain cursed. The soldier hurriedly pulled him back. Don't hold me back. I won't stoop to his level, the captain said angrily. Don't believe him. Although the current situation is bad, these people who hide their heads and tails are even more untrustworthy. The soldier looked in the direction that the man left in. Was the empire really sick? But if the empire wasn't sick, why would it become like this? Seti. The candlestick maker's daughter heard someone calling her name. She turned around and saw Arthas. He was a handsome young man. She liked him. Arthas. Seti snapped out of her thoughts. She wanted to ask Arthas if the empire was really sick. Otherwise, why would her brother die in the south? Why was there a war? But she knew that Arthas didn't want to talk about this with her. He hated those believers, but he hated this even more. The ceremony is about to begin. Arthas waved at her. This way. Seti nodded and squeezed through the crowd to follow Arthas. Today, we are going to end here. All of this, shouts could be heard intermittently. More and more people gathered, and some guys in black robes were giving impassioned speeches. The commotion was like ripples on the surface of the water, spreading through the crowd. Brando and the others walked through the streets and watched in silence. The Shire, Brando, Mephistopheles, Enrich, and Vahina were in a group of 5. They all wore long cloaks and pulled up their hoods. They looked similar to the people giving speeches. In fact, they had been mistaken for those people many times along the way. The people around them were all respectful to them. It was an unexpected coincidence. So this is the capital of the empire. It's amazing, the Shire praised, it really lives up to its name. Those people are really good at persuading people. They're almost as good as my charm magic. It wasn't like this before. Vahina didn't look too good. Even though she was born in Mihodafen, she grew up in this city. She didn't feel good seeing the city that was once the pride of the empire turn into this. I'm afraid something bad is going to happen. The Shire couldn't help but shake his head. Brando also had the same feeling, but he was curious as to why the city guards and patrolling knights didn't do anything. Could it be that the Silver Queen couldn't even control the situation under his watch? Didn't she have the witches working for her? Kill him, he's the Queen's lackey. A commotion came from the street in front of them. Brando and the others were slightly stunned. The crowd in front of them had already gathered together. There seemed to be someone in the middle who was being punched and kicked by the people around him. The Shire, separate them. My lord, there's no need for us to complicate matters. They're blocking our path. Brando replied in annoyance. Charles shrugged. He stretched out his 5 fingers and chanted an incantation. An invisible force spread out from his palm, causing the citizens to move to the left and right. 2 people who were surrounded in the middle were revealed. Judging from their attire, they should be patrolling knights. One of them was in good condition, but the other was lying on the ground on the verge of death. The red-eyed people wanted to surround them again after being separated by the Shire, but they couldn't help but stop when they saw Brando and the others. Speaking of which, who was the one who chose this attire? The Shire couldn't help but admire, it's surprisingly accurate. Didn't you say that this robe doesn't look like a good person? Ah, the Shire suddenly realized, my lord, so this was your idea. Brando ignored him and walked towards the two people. The injured patrolling knight struggled to stand up and shouted angrily, you damned cultists, I don't need your pity. You killed the Shire, come and kill me if you can. Vahina couldn't help but laugh even though she was in a bad mood. This unlucky bastard has the same name as you. Brando teased. Shut your mouth, the Shire felt humiliated and vented his anger on the knight, your friend isn't dead yet. What did you say? I said your friend is still alive, the Shire snapped, if you don't want him to die, take him and get a doctor. The knight's expression changed. He no longer cared about cursing Brando and the others. Although he looked at the Shire doubtfully, he chose to believe him and carried his companion on his back and limped away. Brando looked at their backs, then at the puzzled gazes around him, as well as the faces of those who were twisted by hatred. He could not help but shake his head. Vahina was right. The imperial capital wasn't like this. He had been here before, in another world. At that time, this was a prosperous city. Although it was luxurious, it wasn't as lifeless as it was now. What was it that had caused all of this? He suddenly felt a little gloomy. The Shire, what do you think we're fighting for? Of course it's for Erwin, the Shire replied matter-of-factly, what's wrong with that? The Silver Queen has her own ideals, Brando replied, what she did might not be wrong, but facts have proven that what she did was wrong, the Shire replied, isn't this the best proof? But we're fighting for Erwin, and we're bringing war to Erwin as well. Brando turned to look at his earliest follower and asked, we've never lost an arm or a leg in war, but there are people who have lost everything in war. To them, is what we're doing right? About that, that's a funny question, Andrique couldn't help but interrupt. She mocked Brando with disdain, there's someone holding a knife to your neck, and you still have the time to discuss whether war is right or wrong. There's only victory and defeat, life and death. War for resistance and survival is indeed just. But Erwin's destruction may be inevitable in history, but he chose to do so, and did not hesitate to make many people pay the price. Is everything he's doing really justified? Brando couldn't help but ask this question repeatedly in his mind. Brando, Vahina spoke, there's the best answer to this question right now. Brando looked at the young lady in confusion. Just look at these people and you'll understand. What you've done, 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 what you've done. Teacher once taught me that the progress of history, the progress of civilization, is for the pursuit of happiness. In order to protect everything, people are never stingy with sacrifices. Brendel suddenly understood something in his heart. Perhaps this was the true meaning of the path of the golden flames. The original intention of fighting was not to kill or hate, but to pursue and protect something better. The leader of Abes, Tonajal, and Erwin, does he have the confidence to make this country a better place? Yes. He has the confidence. If that's the case, then it's time to move forward. At this moment, Brando suddenly saw a double in front of his eyes. He suddenly saw the scene he saw in Valhalla. Within the light, Martha put her hand on his shoulder and pointed at his forehead, telling him, I will bestow upon you a pair of wings made of light, that's why I can make you king one day. I will be glorious because of you, this is glory. He raised his head, completely understanding the faith that the flame sword carried in its heart. Let's go, Brando replied. The Frostdew Manor is right in front of us, let us meet that Empress. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.